Good afternoon. I'm going to call our meeting to order, our workshop to order here. We have our agenda this morning, or this afternoon. I say good afternoon, everyone. We have the rezoning update, Dr. Edwards. And then a budget update.
Good afternoon, everyone. We are coming to share our update for comprehensive rezoning. The first slide is just a reminder of our policy 5120, that comprehensive rezoning are based upon these particular outlined points. So financial and administrative efficiency, school capacity and grade level capacity, convenience of access to schools, safe and efficient transportation and travel, effective and appropriate instructional programs, socioeconomic diversity in school enrollments with consideration of equitable impact on student enrollment at each school, and utilization of existing school facilities. So each of those is really broken down, as you'll see on the different slides, these blue bars, where it really kind of highlights that information. The first, we don't have an outline here. I know that Mr. Rilla and the team in finance is going to be talking about finances in general in the budget report for our school district, and you'll be able to see some of the impacts of finances within the district that would impact comprehensive rezoning as well. Our utilization of existing school facilities, the outline here is that, or a focus here is that we want to use our existing school fixtures, recognizing that these average costs for building a new school were pre-COVID, and so it is very likely that those costs could be increased as of now. But for elementary, it's over $35 million, $45 million plus for middle, and more than $70 million to have a new facility at high school. Under each of the slides is also just a compilation or summary of board feedback from the various meetings that we've had and from the information requested that each member would send us. And so we can see where the board is aligned, and then also in some areas where there might be not necessarily alignment, maybe things were ranked in different order, or it seems like there's a different priority. I'm not going to read these from each slide because the final two slides of this presentation really kind of summarize all of that. In our school capacity and grade level capacity, is our 5th, 8th, and 12th grade students, and whether we would also grandfather in siblings. And that would be that if we went through the comprehensive rezoning process, would we keep our senior level students at 5th grade, at 8th grade, and 12th grade? And would we also allow for their siblings to remain at those schools with them? Again, you have board feedback for each of those. The next is our walking zones and consideration when we think about safe and efficient transportation and travel and the access to schools. We can actually outline a 2-mile walk zone for our students and just look at all those kids who are within 2 miles of their current school and build a comprehensive rezoning from that point. Or we can also look at moving students west. Because some of those zones overlap with one another, and you might have a student who's in 2 miles of 2 different schools, we want to make sure that we have some clarity of process as it relates to that and how we're going to move forward. The next slide is about neighborhood schools and transportation, and this is really our focus here is access to neighborhood schools, reducing transportation costs for such, Are we going to move students, which would move students from the western portion of the county to moving them east, and prioritizing socioeconomic demographics of students to promote diversity within schools? This slide has a lot of data on it. It's related to magnet programs, and there's been a lot of conversation, as you know, from the various community input segments that we've had. But it also outlines here that there are several options that can be taken as it relates to our magnet school processes. I wish I could read them all. I know what they are, but the first would be to only permit zone schools to attend magnet schools where we have overcrowding. The second would be whether we would like to consider expanding our magnet courses or CTE programs at the various schools across the district. Thirdly would be to reduce the school-determined entry for those magnet programs. So for instance, if a school was able to have 100 new students allowed into a magnet school, would we reduce that to 50 or to 25 so that we would have lesser students who are not zoned for the school able to actually attend the school? And then the fourth would be looking at whether we would provide transportation for students who are attending magnet programs. And so that can happen a number of different ways when we think about transportation for magnet programs. It could be that we would maintain transportation as it is right now, where all students have the opportunity to ride a bus, but it also shows you here the cost equivalency for that, and we're spending over or nearly $800,000 to transport students who attend magnet programs. So if we think about that first slide with financial efficiency, this is an area where there are some concerns about that, and so some ways that we can look at making changes with that is to reduce that altogether, not provide transportation, to have satellite stops so that we would still provide transportation for families who are attending those schools. But we would determine what those stops would be and be able to lessen the number of students, not students, but buses that we're having going to multiple stops throughout the district. And so, and then also there is the consideration of the actual elementary, middle, and high school. We know that a lot of our elementary schools are not magnetizing students. Our middle schools really haven't had change one way or the other, but high schools, we have a lot of overcrowding. Then there is the ESOL centers. As we look at effective and appropriate instructional programs, we currently have 591 students attending ESOL centers, which are Parker, Westwood, and Gainesville High School. But there are 2,190 students who are speaking languages other than English at home. And so those students are being served at their zone schools, but whether they're in ESOL programs or have ESOL supports at those schools is not indicated here. It could be that there are students who are bilingual and they're speaking other languages at home and they don't need the additional support, but there definitely can be students who are captured within this 2,190 who are at their zone schools who need ESOL services but are not attending the ESOL center.
If we have a question, how do you want us to proceed with it? You want us to wait to the end, or do you want us to stop you if we have a question now?
Yeah, probably to the end, because those 2 pages really kind of summarize it, and I'm almost there.
All right.
The IEP accommodations is really focusing on students with disabilities, and making changes isn't going to necessarily benefit those students. Want to keep in consideration that if we were to move school programs, functional units, we are not just moving students, but we also have to think about the specialized training of staff and particular equipment that might be needed in order to support students who are attending those schools. And then I guess this is more or less the summary, which would be most aligned to what our recommendations would be. So maybe if you have a question, I can receive the question now, or would you like for me to say what we recommend? Okay, so our team has looked at various options, and we have, number one, asked that we would use current data versus the February FTE data that has been presented, so we will have the most recent information with students and their whereabouts, that we would utilize existing school facilities versus building schools because of the financial costs associated with that, and would, of course, want to take away the need to lease portables. We, as a team, would not necessarily recommend closing any additional schools at this time, that we would permit 8th and 12th grades, 5th grade, 8th grade, excuse me, and 12th grade students to remain at schools where there may be magnet programs, but not their siblings. It is counterproductive to comprehensive rezoning to have their siblings also remain at those schools. We would also recommend attempting to keep that 2-mile walkout zone. And that is really, though, you'll see on the next page where we will ask for direction from the board, because we can maintain the 2-mile walkout zone for all students who are currently walking, but we also can take into consideration those students as we move them from west to east. So you might look at some specific areas as a, for instance, if we are moving some kids in the Newberry or High Springs area to Alachua. I know in previous community input sessions, there was lots of concern from parents that we would be moving students all the way to the other side of town. But when we talk about west to east, we're not talking about sending students from Newberry to Hawthorne. We're talking about moving groups of kids systematically across the district, which is still nearby where they currently live or reside. We do know that if we were to look at moving students from west to east, we could think a little bit more about the diversity piece in there, and so with socioeconomics, but that is where we would definitely want to have some direction. We would not necessarily move neighborhood schools, but we would also have to consider SES, right? And so we have neighborhood schools on both sides of the county, depending how you would define neighborhood schools. But we want to also be mindful that in order to create the socioeconomic balance, we also increase transportation costs. And so when we start thinking about transitioning those schools, we realize that it would cost more money to move kids to schools that were not within walking distance or near home. Our thoughts are that we would reduce the number of students or seats that are permitted for magnet programs at overcrowded schools, so that we're able to increase the seat count for schools that are under-enrolled, right? And so you may have students who are not zoned at a school, and I know when we've had conversations and we've talked about schools such as Buchholz, although Buchholz is not the only school with magnet programs. We have magnet programs throughout the district at different levels, but they do have extreme overcrowding. I believe there's about 675 students attending there, and about half of those students are not zoned for Buchholz. So when we look at that and we look at the number that they are still admitting per year, if we reduce the opportunity for students to actually attend Buchholz who are not zoned there, but also increase the number at schools that don't have or have not met capacity, that would be one recommendation for addressing this. And then at the next point, it says to see that the next bullet point for transportation. So that model would be to provide satellite stops at schools and specialized stops. Currently, we have students being picked up all over the county to be brought to magnet programs, not necessarily just on routes that we have. So we have additional routes that are being provided for those students. And so lessening that, having satellite stops that are also at school sites or on the way in a route that we already have to pick up students could address some of the transportation costs. And then we would like to have established rules for courtesy stops. And this was really a recommendation also that came from Transportation Department. We currently have 870 persons who are riding as courtesy riders in the school district. We did look at the maps and found that the ESOL center sites that our students are primarily clustered in their neighborhoods where they live around the current sites. So when we pulled the maps, it did not appear advantageous to move the ESOL centers because most of the students who are attending them are actually in closest vicinity to those particular buildings. And then to maintain intensive needs for students with disabilities. Because of the things that I shared on that other slide, having to move staff and equipment and all of that, those are additional costs that we would have to consider. We would leave put our functional units for ESE at the sites where they already are, at schools, for instance, like Littlewood. And we would also focus on K-12 versus starting with pre-K through 12, and to do our K-12 model and then look at pre-K after we've done the comprehensive rezoning. Those are the recommendations from the team and I know that we're here, we're looking at this so that next meeting, at the board meeting, we would be able to have direction from the board. But number one, our big question is, what would you like for the main focus to be? Is it the finances? Is it, the diversity or what have you? If there can be consensus on that number one thing that is a focus, then that will help our staff to make sure that as we work with DRMP, that we're doing that in the right place. What is the consensus on areas where there didn't seem to be alignment? There's different thoughts that are coming from the different board members on the bullets that fall under here. So the combining and decoupling schools, there's different thoughts about why that is beneficial or not beneficial. So when we are looking at, is this a possible solution, we want to make sure that it's in alignment with what the board wants. And it's not really clear from the feedback thus far. So we know that you all haven't had an opportunity to have those discussions, but this is from the information that was shared with us. And then the level of prioritization for socioeconomic diversity. Although board members felt it was important, the level of prioritization was pretty vastly different as to whether that should be something we do initially or we wait until the end. Clarifying how people perceive or view or define neighborhood schools would be important. Is that just the area that we live in this neighborhood school? Is it based on the demographics of the students who are in the school? There was lots of discussion in some of those areas as it relates to Title I. And so just making sure that we understand when each person, when they say neighborhood school, that you all are meaning the same thing. To determine whether we would maintain magnets at each of the levels. And one of the things that we thought would be important is to separate out elementary, middle, and high because there's different needs at each of those levels. And keeping programs for intensive needs at current locations. One of the things that we realized there is that everyone felt it was really important, of course, to follow the federal guidelines and law. However, the how behind that, like whether we have intensive needs moved to different schools or whether we have like the students who were served by being at the wing or whether we have additional like programs for students, those were all varied. And then the final two bullets are related to the direction of magnet programs. We've shared some of those things just a moment ago, whether we would limit transportation or program acceptance due to the projected growth, whether we want to replicate programs or expand CTE in our 2-mile walkouts. Those are all things that we want to definitely consider and where we want to fall in those 2-mile walkouts. And that's it. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Dr. Edwards, for that. So you've given us a lot, and as you just said, we haven't, as a board, had a chance to discuss this amongst any of this stuff amongst us, and getting the community input sessions. We've had the meetings, right? And we've gotten feedback from the citizens who've come to the meetings or have done forms, and it hasn't been very much. So we've just gotten that one sector. So we kind of need a little bit. I don't want to make it like a time because the budget, but a lot of this also does feed into our budget. It's having one without the other. But I guess we are here because of overcapacity in some schools, or over-enrollment in some schools, under-enrollment in other schools. So that's the dilemma that we're trying to, as a board, to address. And so address the first bullet point that you have there where you all are needing more direction from the board. I guess I'm thinking first frame of mind is to try to go through these right here, is that, but I'm going to wait and see if anybody has any questions before I do that. So go ahead.
So when you talked about reducing seats at magnets, you mean seats for students not zoned to that school, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
And I know we brought up Buchholz as an example. We already did reduce the number of seats, but we're not seeing the full impact of that because it hasn't been a full 4 years of that being implemented. So like, I guess I'm thinking I wouldn't want to further reduce the number of seats when we already reduced it to 25%, right?
No, we haven't reduced the number of seats. I think, are you confusing the lottery with the people that applied? Like 75% of folks apply, 25% is what, is
Oh,
like in
that
the
must
lottery
be-
to
I'm confusing the
try to,
lottery.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah. So.
But, okay, so that was my first question. I also wanted to bring up with ESE, when we talk about following the federal guidelines, we need to consider least restrictive environment. And so when we have self-contained center schools where there are no typically developing peers, there is no opportunity to be included at any time, not at lunch, not at electives, not even walking in the hallway. And so I think we do kind of need to consider that LRE component. And I know, it competes with efficiency, right? Because we have specialized equipment and specialized staff. And how do we do that? But I do have kind of long-term concerns, especially with having K-5 kids with no opportunities to interact with typically developing peers. And I personally think that's something we should consider.
May I ask, when you say consider, are you saying to move where those units are to change what that program looks like?
So I don't want to give direction as just one board member, but I certainly have concerns with us having students who have no typically developing peers on their campus at all. And so, we have 2 center schools like that, but Aquin Jones is typically, we've got that's just middle and high school, first of all, and also the intention is to get those kids back to their zone school. But at Sidney Lanier, and I'm not saying anything negative about their program, but I have concerns legally about the implications of students not having any typically developing peers that they can interact with.
Okay, thank you.
Ms. McGraw, did you have any questions or anything before we started going down to maybe talking about amongst ourselves about some of the stuff on this last page?
I was looking at my policy, I've been looking at zoning for a while, and so I just have some comments. I don't really have a question at this time.
Okay. Mr. Abbott, do you have any questions for Dr. Edwards before we? I don't think so. Okay, all right. All right, so if you would just allow us, I guess, a little bit of time to see if we can kind of come to something here. Ms. McGraw, I'll go back to you. Before you start, could you, right now we have, the district is under a neighborhood zoning concept, right? That was what was decided back then. Can you give us now, you and Ms. Dean, Ms. Moore, what that definition is? So we can start from there, because we're already in a neighborhood zoning concept. That's what the last task force and what was done. So I guess it would help me, it would help me to know what that definition is before I go to telling you what I think mine is, so.
So, currently what we try to do and how we foresee neighborhood schools are those schools where we are placing students close to home. Examples for that would be Rawlings, Metcalf, High Springs Community School. Those schools, or students who are attending those schools, are in close vicinity to where they live.
say that, because we're talking about rezoning, how our parents feel. Has anybody, I know we've had, community input, but I know I've heard, so I'm just trying to see when she says that.
Would you pull your mic closer? I'm not sure.
Can you not hear me? Can you hear me now? Sorry.
Before it was, it's not.
Okay, I'm sorry. Because I know that that's what we're getting feedback, because you do have those parents who are struggling with transportation and different things. So we are, I know, trying to be considerate of everybody. We know we're not going to make everybody happy, but is there any input that you all have received from parents when we think about that? Because we know it minimizes equity, but however, some parents are concerned about having to go too far.
Yes, ma'am. So we do not have input as of yet. It was what was discussed in our last comprehensive rezoning meeting with the team, is how we could actually receive input from our magnet parents and what would be the best methodology for that. So it is part of the conversation, and how can we get the input, and what questions would we ask, and and when I say how can we get the input, just thinking about, does that need to be a part of what we're doing in strategic planning? Are we going to send out a different questionnaire, from the district in order to get that information? So that is what we've discussed.
Ms. Abbott, you recognize?
Yeah, I feel like we're all over the place here. My orderly mind has to go down and answer questions. But so I feel like we have gotten a lot of response from magnet parents at every rezoning thing we've had. They don't want magnets taken away. They certainly don't want us to lower the number of students that can get in magnet programs. And the way I personally feel is that if we have magnet programs with a wait list, we need to be adding more teachers to accommodate those students. And that's one thing that's working well in our district, are the magnet programs, and to make it such that kids are not able to attend magnet programs we're doing a disservice to a huge number of kids. And so I feel like we have gotten some, as far as transportation, I'm sure parents would love to have transportation, the routes that they typically have, and it would be very helpful. I don't know how practical that is with the issues that we're having with transportation, but at the very least, there should be satellite stops. And so I don't know what would be most helpful for you as far as us going through, if we were just answering questions.
No, we're not. I'm gonna manage it a little bit different, if you'd allow me, please.
Oh, I will definitely allow.
Yeah. Actually, I'm a little confused, because we went from trying to define a magnet neighborhood schools. Ms. McGraw asked if we had gotten any feedback from parents about
Yeah, I was just asking.
transportation. No, I'm trying to figure out. And then you mentioned we had gotten feedback from magnet parents. So I was trying to figure out like how magnet came in here, because we were on neighborhood schools and trying to get feedback from them. So that's what.
Oh, did I say?
Yeah, and then Ms. Abbott started talking about that, so I'm like, wait, listen.
I'm sorry, I apologize. When we did talk about magnets, and when she was asking about feedback, that is where my head was. So you were talking about neighborhood schools. We have not, however, received the feedback from either.
Yes, so I think that's like for me, and what was the challenge for me is having followed the rezoning process all these years, right? So from when it was done before, and the neighborhood schools being, the way I would define it is the school that's in the community and children live around it 2 miles, and so you're just gonna automatically go to that school versus there being any movement of students around. And so I made a mention of this on our first meeting. I don't know if my colleagues recall in that. I said neighborhood schools, when we went to that, in essence, because housing is so segregated in our community, is that we, in essence, rolled back all of the diversity that we had in our school district back in 2003. It was like done away with, because at that time, the board elected to go with neighborhood schools. Mm-hmm. And so that meant that we had schools that were either majority white or whatever, and majority black. Mm-hmm. And those have created really tough learning environments, right? So staffing has been very hard if we just look at that. So these are things I was hoping that staff would like tell us, and that challenges that we've had from the neighborhood zoning model. over the past, since 2003, right? We've had schools that have had little to no diversity in them. They've either been high poverty schools or schools that have been very affluent, with very little socioeconomic diversity or racial diversity. So as a board, we have to decide, are we going to continue down that road? But we also have over here every single one of these bullets that we have that to consider to give staff feedback on is the financial impact. And so we can't dodge that bullet, and I kind of hate we didn't do the budget one first, because that would really guide this, because in my view, we have to balance that plate. That's the plate that's at the center that's going to hold all of this together, and how we do this. So
Do you want to switch to budget and come back to the list?
well,
It's the end of the presentation. And I think this workshop gives the board the opportunity to have the discussion. Our expectation was to be able to have feedback by June 6th. So, I mean, if that is what, I understand that and the financial implications and being able to hear the budget.
I have one other question for you before we go forward. The combining or decoupling schools, I just want to make sure I understand what you have there in that bullet point. Combining would say we would take back, like in Alachua, we have a K2, 3-5. That's combining. Decoupling would be in the case of High Springs Community School, where we have K8, so we would make it K5 and 6-8. Is that what you mean, or is that something else to that?
Yes, no, that's what we mean. There was difference in the feedback provided by the board. There were some board members who believed that it was good for them to be separate, K-12, 3-5, where others said that it was better for them to be together. And so just having clarity on, what is the will of the board as it relates to that, whether we pull the grade levels apart, having them together, if at all, right?
Dr. Rockwell.
So one of the questions I have, and I'm not talking about these bullets, but just the list of things within policy that we ranked in the spreadsheet. It basically is like we assigned each one a number. And so like the lowest number would be the highest priority. Did you add up our rankings for all of them to get an overall?
No, there were some where there was alignment where you could see across the board where the board may have had 1, 2, even 3 or 4, but then there were some where it was 2 and 9 in terms of the ranking, and it was split between people. So that happened on several of them, and that's why I was saying that it was unclear, because there was such a wide range or spread between the rank order.
Well, I feel like, obviously, we're in a public meeting now, so we could have seen everyone's rankings and then discussed it. I feel like not knowing what's going on, because, it might be that some of the things kind of grouped together, like when we talk about efficiency, efficiency kind of includes reducing our transportation routes, using our existing facilities. There's a lot of ones that you could just kind of clump together. So maybe somebody ranked financial efficiency really high and then didn't really consider the others because they roll in. I don't know. I'm just trying to, it's really hard to discuss this when we have no baseline to really start the discussion. And
well, I can pull it up, and we can also print it, and I can provide that for you all if need be before you go. But I will tell you that the initial slides where it is sharing the information, that stuff comes directly from that list, and what those prioritizations were from each of the board members. That is the summary of the individual things that were being said, or where there wasn't clarity. That's why in some of them it says there's alignment with the board here, but there is not clarity here. It is taken from that information that you've provided. But I can also pull the information, or I can go and print it and provide it for you so you can see the specific rank orders.
And I also think I said this in the email when I sent back my feedback, but I think in terms of the board feedback, I personally feel like as a board member, I want to give you feedback on those main bullets in the policy, and then give you and your team who have every piece of data and all the information, because there's just so many moving parts. I don't feel equipped to rank some of these other kind of tertiary, secondary and tertiary pieces. And I want you and your team to have the freedom to take those main policy points that we've ranked and then figure out, like, how can we move these kind of other secondary things? What can we do to make those the board's priorities a reality?
Well, actually, the things that you all ranked are the things that are on the slide. I think that in there, because what was shared with you was the summary of what had been provided by board members from previous meetings. Ms. Certain sent the policy ones directly and gave those outlines. As for the remainder of the board, they're related directly to what's on the screen. So, and that is because those things are related to what's in the policy. You're right when you're saying that they're tertiary, but they are supportive of the pieces that are in the policy. And honestly, after she shared hers, I was like, well, we could have just done the board bullet points, but this was because in the discussions we had at the previous workshop, these were the points that came out and we needed to have clarity about. And so that's why I was asking for the feedback from the board on those.
Yeah, and I totally understand that. I just think that if the board gets into, like, if we give you the priorities on the big things that are in the policy, then there's all these supporting pieces. It will guide which of those supporting pieces are priorities automatically. I just think that is more of an operational thing, but that's.
So let me ask my colleagues this right here, if we comment maybe. Our first priority, and as I stated first, what we're trying to do is redraw the attendance line to more efficiently use the existing school building, so we don't have all this overcrowding and under-enrollment. Can we all agree that that is our number one priority, right? To get the core facilities back in alignment with what they are built to be, how were constructed to be used. So building efficiency, right? Being capacity. So I think that it will be number one. Right? So I think, Ms. Abbott, is that? Okay. Okay, and then if we go from there, that we've been told by Mr. Rella and Ms. Nguyen and all that by using the schools and having them operate most efficiently, full schools are more financially efficient as well. I think that then leads us to the second bullet, and we can kind of address that, of combining and decoupling schools, okay? So right now, if we won't just say that across the board, because I think in Hawthorne, they have a 612. I think that has to be made, that decision is made separately when you look at High Springs Community School. In my view, because we just said that we want to use the facilities most efficiently. So in High Springs, we almost have to look at decoupling that, in my mind. Like, this is how I'm going, because it's K-8 and it's overcrowded. I left my rezoning folder in the car, so I don't have my capacity numbers in front of me. I can't say that. But so we may, in that case, have to look at decoupling that school and then seeing what we do with those students. You guys have to give us a recommendation, because we have other facilities that's in the area that we could use for that. And if we decouple High Springs, that may trickle over to cause us to combine in another community.
I understand. Yes, ma'am. I understand what you're saying. I'm not saying that's.
No, I'm so to my colleagues, do y'all have any feedback or any input on that? So I'm just trying to move through this orderly. So
this is kind of what I was saying, was that, like, if we say we're going to prioritize utilization of existing school facilities, that kind of combines with school capacity and grade level capacity, right? Like, they're connected. You can't say we're going to prioritize one and not the other. But then that tells you, okay, if the thing that makes the most sense is to decouple in this area or combine in that area, then that's what we do to meet that priority. And I don't think it's something that you need us specifically to say, yes, prioritize that, because you know better whether it will be the most efficient use of school facilities to combine or decouple. Better than we do with the information we have, certainly.
So, Madam Chair, if I may.
Yeah, because when I told what I told Dr. Edwards when I responded to her, what I think I recall saying is that a lot of what's in the policy, they're interrelated. And I just ranked what I thought were mine. And I didn't put mine in the spreadsheet because y'all had already filled that in, and I didn't want that to look like we were, that was there. So I think these are related. Yes, Mr. Andrew.
And that's exactly right. So I think it's fair to say all of those listed in policy 5120 are important to the school board, all of our district staff and colleagues in the community. And I think quite a few of those are intertwined. So as we look at it, definitely our finances have a big impact on all things we're considering. So I think working into this new budget, that's going to help bring some clarity there. I think we should keep in mind certainly capacity and utilizing those existing schools. Those all go together. Certainly we know our folks want convenient access. At the same time, they want quality schools across the district in all neighborhoods. And working on that is a little different than just strictly rezoning. That's a whole different piece of our work. But nonetheless, we've heard them clearly say that, and we all value the socioeconomic diversity in our school enrollments and those things. So I say all that to say, I think we also have to be having this discussion that this isn't the one and only time we're going to rezone, and we're not going to fix everything with this rezoning. I think what we need to do is given our financial situation, what can we do now, given our limitations with employees in any department, transportation, one example, instructional, food and nutrition, all of that, but let's just talk the transportation piece. Based on the number of employees we have in human resources, we can only operate within what we can do with set amount of drivers and the routes needed. So I think it's one of those things that we want our community to be thinking about. This isn't a one rezoning and then we're done for 40 years or 20 years or 10 years, not even 5 years. I think we do a rezoning and it doesn't have to be turn everything upside down, but make some gradual changes. And as we continue to have schools come online, Westwood, Littlewood, what have you, and new builds, that we need our community to be prepared that we're going to have some slight rezoning, not comprehensive every other year, but we're going to have some slight rezoning and some tweaks to help stay up with trends and movements within our county, not just this one-time reaction to the last 40 years of growth. So I just say all that to say, yes, I think all of these are important to our board members, our community, and our stakeholders. So I do think the finances right now and the limitations there, which I know I'm singing to the choir in this room, that that's driving the bus, so to speak, as well. And I do think we can still work some on our capacity and the use of our existing facilities. So that being said, I do want our public to hear. I think this is something we need to start revisiting more frequently and make those gradual changes as needed.
Madam Chair, can I also just say that just listening, hearing what you're saying, what the superintendent says, and looking at the information that you all shared, if we look at policy 5120, I'm going to try and summarize what I believe, I think you all have said, which is to prioritize financial and administrative efficiency, that secondarily the utilization of our existing school facilities would be a priority for the board. School capacity and grade level capacity as it relates to policy requirements for those students, but then our safe and efficient transportation and travel, followed by convenience of access to schools, and then our appropriate instructional programs, followed by socioeconomic diversity, is what I feel like in the summary of all things that have been shared and what has been sent might be what prioritization is. And so maybe if we can go there, because what I feel like you all are saying is that you can rank order policy 5120, but you will not provide the feedback for the what is considered to be the operational pieces in the other areas where we're asking for board direction. Is that
I think
pretty much?
I was just saying, what I did when I got the presentation, that's the first thing I did. I pulled out the policy and kind of just looked at them and ranked them. So financial and administrative efficiency was number 1. School capacity and grade level was number 2. I did look at social, economic, and diversity because I'm, leveling the playing field for all students to the best of our ability. But like Mr. Andrews said, we're not going to be able to do everything. And then the quit gerrymandering the schools, and let's look at magnet programs for all school. I took the policy because we had so much feedback, but then also I got feedback, like I was saying, with neighborhood, because I know parents struggle sometimes getting their kids through transportation. So I think today, for purposes, we're not going to be able to give you everything. I think we all need to go back and think about it, is what I see overall a little bit more now that we've had the input, but also looking at the policy. And removing some things. Convenience, I mean, if a parent really wants their child to go to a magnet program, we expand them because I do want to see more magnet programs. And they may have to provide the transportation. I mean, that's just the bottom line. And so we'll have to look at that because we can't give everything. But, and so I even said convenience to access to remove from the policy. That was just my thinking forward. So I kind of went down the policy and selection of what we had. So, but we won't be able to solve it all today, but I do think that we need to hear, say, more of the finance piece. But that's just my thoughts, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Ms. McGraw. Dr. Alachua?
I agree with Ms. McGraw's rankings. I would say, financial and administrative efficiency is obviously going to guide all of this because we have a very tight budget, but and I think that leads into us using our existing facilities and, making sure our schools are within capacity for the school and grade. But after that, I agree with Mrs. McGraw that we should be prioritizing socioeconomic diversity in schools. I think we can pretty easily track the consequences of the 2003 elementary rezoning that prioritize convenience to the schools. And I'm not saying that we get rid of 2-mile walk zones because to be financially efficient, we can't be transporting kids who live within a walk zone, which is why financial efficiency is number 1. But as much as we can while maintaining financial efficiency, I think we need to move socioeconomic diversity up in priority because I think when we talk about having effective and appropriate instructional programs, we do that. We're using a state-adopted core curriculum. We're using a science of reading-based supplemental curriculum in K2 and expanding that to intervention. What is hindering effective instruction is having schools that lack funding because they're under-enrolled and that lack support because they're in a community where the families are working more jobs, have less access to transportation to get to the schools, have fewer financial resources to donate to the schools, contribute to fundraising efforts, those kinds of things. And if we can look at our socioeconomic diversity, all we have to do is look back at the meeting where we had in the public records every school's internal account to see the disparity between one school that has over $100,000 in their internal account and another school that has less than $10,000. And that's their internal fundraising accounts. And so, this is some of the impact of us deprioritizing socioeconomic diversity 20 years ago. And so I think it's really important that we reprioritize that now.
Ms. Abbott, do you have anything else you want?
I feel like we've talked about these at every workshop that we've had, and we've said the same things over and over again. I think that we have to look at the financial aspect of it, but we can't water down our education anymore. I mean, this is a district that is in really bad shape educationally, and programs that are working and are serving our kids well, like magnet programs, we cannot dilute those in any way for any reason. And So I think that that's an important discussion that you need to have with the board, that we need to have, because you need to know how we feel about that. This is my opinion on how I feel about it. But the effective and appropriate instructional programs is up there pretty high for me. I mean, if we don't have that, what are we existing for? And so that's all I have.
Thank you, Ms. Abbott. So for me, I can agree with some parts of what each of my colleagues have said. But what I do want to emphasize, and I want to kind of go back to something that Dr. Rockwell said, and just kind of discuss with you, with the neighborhood schools. I don't think the internal accounts are what's keeping, some of that is the money they get from the advanced placement course, but the fundraising doesn't necessarily run through there. Like the PTA doesn't necessarily run through the internal accounts. Is that correct, Mr. Rella? The PTA fundraising and external fundraising at the school level, is it all in the internal accounts? The PTAs, I thought, had their own separate bank account?
So typically, the PTA as a booster organization would be external. I would say, and again, having worked with these internal accounts for a long period of time, you can notice pretty stark discrepancies between schools, and the correlation is socioeconomical makeup of the school typically, because you need parent support, you need volunteers, you also need financial support, and those things. So for schools that don't have families that have surplus income, it could certainly be a challenge. But you can, I think Dr. Rockwell mentioned the situation, but yeah, we see big differences.
Thank you for that. So I think in addition to the financial aspect piece, Dr. Rockwell, the lack of diversity in the schools also hinders hiring, which also negatively impacts the student outcomes of the students that's in there. So while I am a proponent of having special programming and magnets, and and can agree with what you say somewhat, Ms. Abbott, I'm not all in on magnets, whereas we provide more resources to those students and less to ensuring that students in a regular school that's not in a neighborhood school, just a regular old major program student, isn't getting a fair shake at things. That I can't go with that one. So I got to create a school environment where we can have it fully staffed with teachers teaching just regular general ed programs, so because those students deserve to have a free and appropriate public education, just like the special programming that we're offering for the students. And that's not to say, I want to make myself very clear, that's not to say that I disagree with magnets and want to discontinue them. It's just that I want my focus to be on us making sure we create a school environment where every student can have, and their parent can expect them to get standards-based instruction every single day that they're in school. And we have some environments, as I said in a previous workshop, that have been created by the neighborhood zoning concept, where they're hard to staff schools and people don't want to work in those schools. And that's not something that people like to hear, but those students are being shortchanged, and those school leaders, and it's a challenging environment, so I think that we have to go and address that. So I think we've summarized and kind of given you guys what you all need, have we not? And if you need anything else, I think maybe you tell us that now, and we.
One other thing, when we're talking about magnets, I'm not just talking about those special programs. We talked about, remember, Ms. Ritter was here before. We want to make sure we have entrepreneurship, CTE programs, because everybody's not on to college. But when we know that our kids have something in that school where they feel great about doing, or they feel good about what they're doing, they'll do better, and it'll help us with discipline. So I know it's a lot, but and that's what I wrote. It's several entrepreneurship programs, CTE, magnet programs, because what does help us, if we spread it out, you have good programs in all of the schools, then there is better education for all of the children.
And Dr. Edwards, I just want to add to this that even though I am an advocate for magnet programs, I think everyone in this room knows that I fight for kids in SI schools more than anyone in here, and so I want every kid to have a good education, but I don't feel like we have to water down what's working in order for every child to get a good education.
Thank you. Yes, thank you.
Questions? Okay. I ain't gonna get into a PISSING contest on SI schools, because my work speaks for itself on the board, so I don't even have to do that. Everybody knows in here where I stand, and the staff probably sick of me saying, for 4 years, they probably sick of me hearing me say a turnaround school at SI.
These SI schools for so many years in here, because so much is being done on this board.
Yeah. Well, you know, Ms. Abbott, the board members aren't at the school, but we sure can advocate for having good things being there. I completely agree with you, but you know what? If I went to a school and I started trying to tell the principal what to do, someone could file an ethics complaint against me. And they could file one against you too, and I wouldn't want that to happen. So our advocacy for improving student outcomes are the reason why both you and I sought a seat on this board. And the citizens trusted us enough to vote for us because they believed that we would come and bring our all to advocate for every single student in Alachua County to receive high-quality public education. So are you all, does anyone else have any other questions for Dr. Edwards and her team, Ms. Moore and Ms. Boyer? Y'all have anything else? Y'all have what you need from us to go forward and to come back with that? You may hear something out of this budget meeting that comes up, some questions and comments. We might have to circle back to y'all, but.
Alex may say that he's going to give us additional funding to make it all work like a charm.
Is Alex going to be the candy man on his way out?
Don't anticipate.
I don't think so, but thank you.
All right, thank you, Dr. Edwards and your team. Thank you all. Did you all want to take you all need a break or anything before we go to the next group? Y'all need anything? Are we good to go? Okay. All right. All right. Well. Did you all need a break before we could continue on? Everybody says they're good to go. All right, plow on through. Mr. Burkett, I have not had the pleasure of meeting you. Tina Certain, hopefully I'll get over to meet you here in the near future.
Yes, ma'am, thank you. I look forward to working with you and working together for what's good for our schools. I know that one of the reasons I considered this was because I believe in my heart that Alachua County has the best schools in the state of Florida with our programs and our teachers. When
Could you slide your mic closer to you? I think we're going to need you to have your mic closer to you so we can hear you.
When you invest 40 years of your life into something, it becomes part of you. And so anyway, but thank you for the opportunity.
Yes, welcome. And
Thank you.
I had a chance, Madam Chair, to meet Mr. Burkett prior to, after winning the election. He was kind of my professor in finance. We met, so I'm so happy that he's here. Thank you so much.
all right, I'm going to let you guys take it. I'm not
Yeah,
sure
we'll
who's
get
leading
things
it.
kicked off. Appreciate the opportunity. As always, to be in front of the board. It's the last day of school, so we throw a little last day of school picture in there. So I know a lot of our staff's going to be extremely excited today, this afternoon. My daughter is not one of those. She's devastated. So, but I appreciate the opportunity again. This will be obviously my last workshop. Have enjoyed doing this work, and the most important piece in the budget is getting feedback from the board. And that's obviously what we hope to accomplish today. I did want to introduce two people that I hold in very high regard. My mentor, Mr. Keith Burkett, extremely grateful for him. When he said he was interested, I gave a collective sigh of relief. This man is, as you could probably will notice, district-centered. He's very dedicated, incredibly knowledgeable, and willing to step in at a time where student public K-12 finance is extremely dynamic, so we're very appreciative of him. And also Ms. Talia Ford, who's stepped up and has been in the budget director role and has really taken the bull by the horns. She's been a sponge over the last couple weeks. It's been really incredible to see her growth. These three have been working hand in hand, almost seems like all day, every day, with some meetings in between. But there's been days like last Friday where I told Talia, I feel like I'm leaking brain fluid a little bit.
Trying to get
She's
it
like,
all
well,
out.
I feel like a zombie. So, but we've done some really great work over the last few weeks, and we want to share that with you. The budget cycle is always a challenge. This one is not an exception. Every single one comes with its own challenges. We have had an opportunity to meet with the budget committee. I think we've had 6 meetings, so a lot of the stuff that has been, the committee recommendations been incorporated in the budget. One of the big things that we wanted to accomplish before this meeting is to have a preliminary budget. So that's kind of what we wrapped up on Friday and had to throw it all on slide decks quickly to get this information to you. We attempted to keep it short, but that, as you can probably notice, is not the case. But it was really difficult to line item stuff out of here because we feel like it's all important information. And just one programming note, so we did receive today, Ms. Ford received the updated property value estimate from the property appraiser's office, so we do have some changes in here that we'll try to point out as we go along. But this is going to be certainly a group effort. I'm kind of passing the torch, so hope to not talk very much, but very capable hands. So at this point, I'll turn it over to Ms. Ford.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair, board members, Superintendent Andrews, and Deputy Superintendent. Last day of school, hooray. It's also my last day of school with Rella's School of Budget, so I just want to give special thanks to him, and that's all I'll say, or I will ugly cry. Please excuse any jitters in my voice. This is my first time. So, I need to work the clicker, sorry. So we're pushing full steam ahead with our trim timelines. As Mr. Rella pointed out, we do have a preliminary budget ready. Some major things that are coming up would be to ensure that we have our advertisement in the Gainesville Sun. Mr. Burkett will be helping me out in that arena as well. And the final approved budget will be presented to the board along with, I believe, the AFR September 11th. By us having that preliminary budget now, we can make any modifications up to September. Not too many, please. Moving to our next slide, and please excuse me as I'm flipping, trying to keep my thoughts together. We are playing right now what Rella has described as the guessing game. So I just want to point out that the preliminary budget is off of projected enrollment numbers. There will be, of course, effects with the HB1 and whatever movement is going on with families over the summer that we're not aware of. So just want to remind everyone that the numbers are projected. We're hoping that we are close, but we will not have actual final survey numbers. There is an October survey, but then the final numbers for that first survey, we would not receive those until December, so. Keep that in mind. So again, we have drafted the preliminary budget using the estimated student enrollment. Overall, for 22-23, we did come pretty close with our district traditional FTE counts. If you notice in the columns, we are comparing 22-23 actual FTE numbers with the projected FTE. It looks like the elementary will take possibly a large hit. Again, that's with House Bill 1 taking effect, and we'll go more into that on the next slide. And of course, that enrollment is affected due to the private schools. Our district schools also, our district special centers also are seeing a bit of a decline there, as well as the virtual FTE and I'm told that we're back to pre-pandemic numbers. Charter schools, there is a slight increase. That increase in charter school FTE, we have 2 new charters for the 23-24 year. That's Constellation and Santa Fe College Academy of Science and Technology. That will be starting as well. I'm sorry, I did not say it before, but if you have any questions or comments, please stop me anytime.
Ms. Ford, could you tell the district special centers, is that Aquin and Sydney?
Yes, DJJ's,
DJJ?
Aquin Jones, Sydney Lanier, and I believe, okay, yes, those, sorry.
Thank you, those 3. I was just trying to make sure.
So obviously the big bill this year was House Bill 1. I think it passed and was signed before legislation, or before the legislative session even wrapped, so that kind of shows you the kind of importance, and it was an unusual situation because you don't generally see that. I will say, and I probably shared before, it's unusual to have something so sweeping considered and passed, and then they kind of went back and like, oh wait, what impacts this going to have on our enrollment? So that, you know, they went back and did an estimating conference, which is the first time I think that's happened. But so this is the big one, obviously universal vouchers, and, you know, it allows them to take the funds, put it in the savings account, and then they can take that to a private school. So there's kind of 2 different kinds of students as I see it. One is students that are within our school that are going to be exiting the district and going to private school, and the other, which I think is going to be a larger portion, is the group that's already in private school, already paying tuition, but now we're going to get not a gift card, a savings account to help you pay for that. And there's a bunch of other expansionary items in there. We've really tried to keep this summarized because House Bill 1 is extremely long. The legislative changes are expansive. A couple of the other pieces that were in House Bill 1 of import is the suspension of the total cost per student station, which will impact facilities as we build new ones in the future. And that goes till July 1st, 26. And then there was some section in there on transportation that gives school boards a little bit more flexibility in terms of use of vehicles. That'll be something we need to consider as we move in to next year.
A few legislative budget highlights before getting into the actual numbers. I believe a lot of the categoricals that are listed on the slide have been in place for many years, and looks like the funding model has just recently changed. The reading categorical allocation, is going to be rolled into the base student allocation. None of these statutory requirements have been lifted off of any of the categoricals that are listed, but they are rolled into the BSA. The instructional materials allocation, as well as the teacher's classroom supply program. Instead of teacher classroom supply program being, allocated per teacher based off of the teacher count, it's now just a flat $300 that will be distributed to each teacher. TSIA, which is the teacher salary increase allocation, is rolled also into the BSA. Many of those restrictions have been removed, including reporting, funding compression allocation, and our turnaround school supplements have been rolled up into the BSA as well.
So I have a question. So the per pupil allocation went up, but essentially all these categoricals were removed and are added in that. So there's not really an increase at all. And so is it not just it's not an increase, but are we more in the hole?
So we'll cover some of those when we look at a big picture level. I would say, you know, again, kind of like House Bill 1, a lot of decisions were made without a great deal of consideration, and, you know, the finance officers pushed back hard on a few pieces. And I will say, in general, there's really good parts of this budget, and there's parts that we don't like. We've been complaining about the categoricals forever because we want flexibility with our dollars. But they kind of went halfway, right? So they eliminated the allocation, but they didn't eliminate the underlying requirement. So for example, for reading categorical, we still have to do a reading plan. So we're budgeting for all those categoricals like we always have. We just don't have that specific allocation for it, but we have to budget for these things. We need to buy textbooks and things like that. So, it's a funding formula that's been in place for 50 years, and we've tinkered with it over the years. They completely fundamentally changed it, and I think as I think through it, probably not, the intent wasn't to make it easier for districts. I think the intent was to combat some of the political arguments that go around using public funds for private schools. That's my personal opinion. But just in general, I think there's some wins and some losses, but it does make the comparison difficult, right?
Question. Let's go back to the classroom teacher supply program. Is that not the same as it has been? I mean, not rolling it in, but the same amount? No?
The way that calculation works is we take the total allocation divided by the total number of eligible teachers, and that tells you how much you have per teacher. There's no allocation anymore. So what they're saying is you have to provide at least 300 per teacher that's eligible, and those funds are rolled in the base. I think
I certainly thought that was the same back in 1990, $300 per teacher.
It's all the behind the scenes.
That's what we used to give. Okay, thank you.
So with all of these things being rolled into the BSA, that means that they are all subject to the BSA being prorated, correct?
So we haven't gotten to the proration yet, but they're actually, when I said there's wins and losses, that was a win. So that's one of the biggest things that we deal with is the proration of funds. And they did two things. They provided a stabilization, which Ms. Ford's going to talk about in a second. And I think they prevented us from having a proration in statute. So we don't have to worry about the proration any longer, which is really good news.
Okay, that's really good news because I was concerned about that.
Let me ask one question. When you say the $300 per teacher, does that include every teacher, or you said something about eligible teacher? Does that include VPK or no?
So it's certified classroom teachers, media specialists, and guidance.
Okay.
And they have to be full-time. So there are, like the VPK teachers are non-instructional, they're non-certified teachers, so they would be exempt. There are some groups where we've had, and I think of like our OTs and PTs, where we provide some supply money through the class wallet system, which Ms. Ford implemented. But it's not a requirement in statute necessarily.
Thank you.
On to our next slide. There is a additional 104,000 scholarships, with 20,000 of those scholarships being funded out of the non-reoccurring Florida tax credit scholarship funds. Many of you remember the DCD, district cost differential, that has been changed now to comparable wage factor, so that all districts that are below the 1.0 threshold would round up to 1.0. And here's that good news. The Enrollment Stabilization Fund, there's $350 million in non-reoccurring funds allocated for potential increase in family empowerment scholarships. And additional good news would be the Group 2 cap. That cap has been eliminated on weighted programs such as ESE 254 and 255, ESOL and career technical programs as well. For class size reduction, the financial penalties have been eliminated. But you'll also see decreases per program to the right-hand side as well. And we'll go deeper into the numbers on the next few slides.
I do want to make one quick note on the family empowerment. So that when they were going through budget conference, I mentioned the re-estimation conference that they did, which is unusual. The Senate was at 124,000 additional students, and the House was at 84. So basically what they did through the estimating conference is kind of split the baby, if you will. So they went up to 104, but instead of rolling those into the FEFP and paying for them out of FEFP GR at the state level, they paid for them out of one-time funds. So that's important because next year, there won't be those one-time funds remaining in 24, 25. So I just want to mention that because they're going to have to pay the full cost next year for 24, 25, sorry.
And Mr. Rella, this was 104,000 statewide?
Mhm.
I'm just still like, can't believe how they seem like it's a minimum number that they're only expecting to apply to get the Family Empowerment Scholarship.
Well, it's, again, I think Celia used the phrase guessing game. I think we're all kind of doing a lot of that because we don't know necessarily what's going to happen. And I think that's what, I would definitely urge the board and superintendent to exercise a lot of caution until we know what our student counts are in terms of any kind of expansionary things. Because we're making a forecast based on, what's been provided to us for the DOE, but that's going to be very district specific in how it's applied and what the reality actually ends up being. So, if we come, we're through our 10-day counts and we're down 500 kids in our traditional K-12 brick and mortar, that's going to be a really big problem. And if you think about how many students we have and how many scholarships in private schools we have, that could happen.
So for the 24-25 school year, they would have to, this doesn't recur, so for the next budget, it would have to be renegotiated?
It'll just have to come out of state general revenues. Instead, they have to pay the bill. So they use one-time funds out of Florida tax credit that they had built up over years. Those funds are gone, so now it rolls back into general revenue for the state.
But then they'll have some idea of what that amount would be because it'll have been in effect for a year. Is that presumably?
Presumably, yeah.
My guess.
That, yeah.
My guess is enrollment and it would go up the following year because more people will know about it. But
Well, you get the fact that more people know about it. You have the word of mouth, but you also have the fact that we have many private schools locally that are building out capacity as we speak.
right.
So those would be students that would have gone into K-12, traditional K-12, that are no longer doing that.
That was beautiful.
The class size reduction, I haven't read all of HB1. I've been kind of skimming through it. I see the penalty is eliminated, and the funding, it seems like, for each level is decreased. So now, do you don't have to meet it? I'm just asking.
I think in that situation, we're still going to have to comply with the constitutional change, which was lowering those class sizes. So when the auditors come and do their audit, if we're out of compliance with the Constitution, that could be a substantial comment in an audit. So I think we're going to have to maintain those class levels with the funding we have.
But it will be interesting to see what districts do in that regard, because if you think about our costs, that's probably the most limiting factor that we have, and I'm not suggesting we go with crazy class sizes, but the class sizes, the way they are, really limits what we can do financially. It's like a required cost for us, basically.
Okay, on to our capital outlay funding for charters. The statute has been amended, and moving forward, beginning in 23-24, the district is now required or responsible for sharing a portion of the $1.5 million capital outlay with the charter schools. They've given us guidance on a 5-year glide path, is what they're calling it, where we will begin sharing with charters at 20%, and then increasing that by 20% for the following years, up to 5 years, until we are sharing 100% of that per FTE allocation with charters. So we will no longer receive, I believe, the $1.1 million from the state that directly flowed through to the charters. This will come out of our current funding, excuse me.
might continue the good news. The teacher salary increase allocation, which this board and previous boards have had the pleasure of negotiating. If you remember in the beginning, we had like the 80-20 rule, where 80% had to go to the raise the minimum teacher. I think last year it was 50-50, so only 50% had to go to raise the minimum teacher salary. They've changed that legislation, so we're, as a district, including charters, we're going to receive close to $2.5 million, and we can use that to either increase the minimum base salary for the classroom teachers, or we can use it for teachers across the board. So basically, we're in my mind, we're kind of back to a normal negotiation situation, which is wonderful. And continuing, so we have some Alachua specific legislation. So they have created, it's called the Florida School for Competitive Academics. And I'm not going to read through this entire thing, but there was some interesting information in there that I wanted to pull out, or that we wanted to pull out. So it's going to serve grades 6 through 12. It's for next year will be a planning year, and then they will open in 24-25. The funding and organizational structure is really unique. It has aspects of both K-12 and post-secondary private schools. They have a board of trustees, which is going to be appointed by the governor, and that board, similar to what this board does, really does the rulemaking. They do student admissions, hiring, and the HR aspects, and then they submit budget requests to the Department of Ed for next year. And I think what kind of makes this unusual is, one, I don't think we've ever had a fully private, state-funded private school, which is kind of what this is. But two, they can they're outside of the FEFP, and they do a legislative budget request similar to like what the Department of Ed would do. They send a budget request for what they want for the following year, and then the legislature appropriates based on their circumstances. So for next year, for the planning year, they're going to receive a little over $4 million, and then they are also eligible for funds from the Fixed Capital Outlay Office in the Department of Ed, and all their employees are eligible for FRS, similar to they would be for us or the state, and then they're exempt from most of the statutes. There are some that they have to comply with, but in general, a lot of I think they only listed the ones they have to comply for, so they excluded clearly a lot of the statutory requirements that we have. That's what makes it kind of like a private school. So very unusual. I think for us, it's going to be, a little bit of a shock to the system, because it's going to be most likely really high achieving students, which help our schools, and also take an unknown amount of students out of our schools. I've heard, it's not in the legislation, I've heard it's going to be around 400 students, but it's certainly opportunity. If you have, not subject to our funding, but you just make a request to the state in terms of what you want, and your board is appointed by the governor, you're probably in a pretty good standing, I would say, financially. So I think this is something that's really big. I just wanted to bring this. I know you guys have probably all seen this individually, but a big impact as we move into the 24-25 cycle.
On to the numbers. We went over the different categoricals that have rolled into the BSA. So the numbers before you are comparing our Calc 4 figures to the 23-24 conference report. Of course, there's an increase on the BSA line. Again, the DCD is going away for the 23-24 year as they have implemented the comparable wage factor. Our unweighted and weighted FTE has increased. And I believe the school taxable value, that was one that we just received the estimate on. So if you wanted to update that number, it is $24,550,000,000.
If I could just make a comment on the BSA. rolling these categoricals into the BSA is a typical plan of the state, because if you go through history, just about every categorical has been listed on the calculations, has been rolled into the BSA. Years ago, we had the seventh period day, that was a categorical that was rolled into the BSA. Alachua County kept that seventh period day for about 5 years, but then had to eliminate it because of the funds. So it's a way of putting money into the BSA that's there, but it's not visible, and it sort of becomes transparent over time. So.
I won't read over every number that's before us, but it's more comparisons of our Calc 4 versus the conference report. Again, with our weighted FTE multiplied by the BSA and the comparable wage factor, there's an increase of 30 million. Also an increase on the ESSE guarantee. Again, you can see the categoricals that have rolled into the BSA, but as Mr. Rella stated, we are budgeting for those appropriations still.
But, Ms. Ford, and actually the team, the 30 million increase is like not really good, because that looks like, to me, where that's being calculated using the scholarship and, and the private schools and the charters and scholarships, and that's not under district control. So I think it would be most helpful for me if you all would not do that, like do above and below the line number, like our impact for what we will have here in the district that's up under our control that we can use to budget with, separated out from what. Does that make sense? Because this 1,700 students.
It's a great point. So this is how it's kind of reported to us, and it becomes difficult. And we've had this conversation with leadership at the Department of Ed. They provide us with the funding, like this is how much you're going to get. Subtract out the family empowerment scholarships, but we don't get individual line item, how much they're receiving for safe schools, how much they're receiving for mental health. We don't get that level of detail, which is kind of why we unfortunately have to report this way. That's something that we've requested from their staff probably 3 years in a row. Where we account for the scholarships is kind of towards the end, where we're subtracting out all the charters, all the private school vouchers in that last slide, 14.
I was following, I guess, like, to me, because I think in looking at this here, it just doesn't look, it looks like we're okay, but we're not okay. Right, and I don't want anyone to the untrained eye, or for us to look and say, well, wait, over here you're saying we got this increase of 30 million, and then back, because later on I'm going to have another little flag I'm going to be raising, and it's, where it looks like our expenses are more than what our expected revenue are. There's a shortage, so this makes it look that it can be confusing, is what I'm saying, and so I'm just trying to figure out a way that we can present the numbers for what we have and what we're going to have to be able to manage through, meaning we, like us, the team, go. That's the request I'm making, and I don't know if that's possible.
Your next slide, you're going to see where that is adjusted, I think, out.
Ms. McGraw, did you have something? I saw you. Okay. That's right.
And I'm also looking at the things rolled in, and that accounts for, I didn't take out my calculator, but just estimating almost about 16.5 million of that 30.
That's kind of a product of like making these substantial changes. It does make it very difficult to explain. One, it also makes it incredibly difficult to bargain. Because when you look at the top line number of 30 million, it's like, all right, we're doing 50% raises. And it's like, no. But yeah, we'll work through that. And there's a bunch of different stuff in here that we'll speak to in that regard.
Our next slide goes further into different categorical changes. The top line, SAI, has now been renamed to Educational Enrichment Allocation, with a slight increase of 940,000. Again, TSIA rolled into the BSA, the teacher classroom supply, and then you'll see the class size reduction on that last line. I will say that though the teacher salary allocation is rolled into the BSA, they did actually identify the amounts that are to be used or allocated for maintenance and what should be allocated towards growth. And that was the 2.4 that Mr. Rella discussed earlier. So they did properly identify that in the conference report. Now onto our legislative summary, where you will see that 30 million subtracted out. So we have our total state funding increase and decrease column, the scholarship deductions and the difference there, and then the state funded discretionary. Again, this is comparing Calc 4 to the 23-24 conference report. So our net state funding overall increase is 8.7 million. And then you have the discretionary millage and required local effort to give us the net potential funds of an increase of 15 million.
I didn't take my calculator to this before coming to his. The discretionary, I think I just answered my own question. I was getting ready to say the capital millage, the 1.5 mil. I was wondering if you took out the amount, the 20% that was going to charters, but that's not here. That the discretionary millage is the 7.748.
On to our estimated 23-24 general fund revenues. I do want to point out, that this is a comparison between the 22-23 approved budget compared to our 23-24 estimated budget. So it's a like-for-like comparison, but it does not include the changes that were made throughout the 22-23 fiscal year. Again, I don't want to read line for line to you. But as far as, again, 22-23 approved budget versus estimated budget for 23-24, our FEFP has an increase of 9.6 million. Class size reduction has been reduced, and you'll see that charter school capital line, the decrease there. Continuing on, our required local effort is up 4.3 million. The 1 mil, again, has been increased based on our estimate. Interest increased as well. And then lastly, at the bottom, our transfer from capital would need to increase as well by 3.2 million.
Is that due to the increase in property insurance? Or is that you bringing that over with in anticipation of plugging the budget as well?
So it's kind of both. So obviously, we've used the 1.5 mil transfer. We have eligible expenses, exceeding, I think, 12 million. I think they increased the cap this year for how much you can transfer as well. So we've used it when we have increased costs in the general fund for things such as property casualty insurance, which is like 1.7 million. And we've kind of used it as a balancing mechanism in terms of making sure we have enough revenue to support our estimated costs. But again, a lot of this stuff is a bit of a work in progress. We're going to get our Calc 2 budget, as Ms. Ford mentioned, in July. They'll adjust the required local effort amounts and kind of recalculate the FEFP. So there's a potential, if the tax roll increases beyond the estimate, that we could receive additional 1 mil funds. And then they also provide a prior year funding adjustment on the RLE if we didn't receive the full 96%. So, it's definitely not a finished product in terms of revenue until we get to that Calc 2 situation. But, obviously using the best information we have at this point. So looking, $19.1 million in additional revenue, which is the highest I've ever seen, but there are a lot of additional costs that the district is facing right now.
So I'm just going to put this out here. I don't like that additional revenue being the capital millage being used, being swept over the general fund outside of the property and casualty insurance to be the budget fill, us considering that like additional revenue, because that's really going to impact what is available to work off the capital projects list, which we all know those projects are costing more because of the inflation that we're experiencing in the construction market now. So to my colleagues, this is not a long-term solution. I won't go into how I melted down with Mr. Rella and the auditors about us using more of those funds with that, but that is something we're gonna have to be very, very cautious with proceeding forward.
It's just another perfect example how schools are not funded to the level they need to be.
Perfect example, exactly. So since it ain't changing any, but yeah.
So there were some pretty big changes to the FRS system, and we'll talk about the rates in a second. But they made some adjustments to the restrictive window to the eligibility for drop. The second bullet, in my opinion, is a big one that we push for. If you're a former teacher, for example, and you retire, you have to sit out 6 months to a year, depending on what plan you're on, or you're going to jeopardize your retirement. So they created like a new program for volunteers specifically, where they can volunteer in schools as long as they're not exceeding. There's some requirements like they can't work more than 20 hours and stuff like that, but it does provide us some flexibility as a district, and that has come up a lot in the last few years. So that is, I think, a win, something that we push for. At least I know I push for a lot with our lobbyists. They also made some adjustments to the drop window based on the staffing shortages that we're looking at. The traditional instructional personnel had the 5 years of drop, 3 years of drop extension for a total of 8, and they've increased that to 10, so you can be in drop for 10 years, which is huge. Similarly, for non-instructional employees, the drop period has always been 5 years. They've extended that to 8, and that's also good news. And they've increased the drop, the interest rate on drop members' deposits from 1.3 to 4, which is, I think, maybe what it was way back on when. But that's a huge, that's a huge win. That makes drop a lot more attractive. So I'm sure we'll see the benefits of that at some point. All of those changes.
Skip that last bullet there.
Well, it's on this slide too. All these changes obviously come at a cost, and there was a period of time where the House was pushing this really, really radical reform, and the Senate went with a more traditional model, and they kind of met in the middle, if you will. But we are looking at really, really significant increases to all of our classes. The regular class, which is where 95% of our employees are members of, is a 1.66% increase. And then special risk, which we only have one of those, 4.8. And then drop 2.5 based on, obviously a lot of the changes made there and elected officials. So, and they also increased the required deposit on the investment plan from 9.3 to 11.3. So just a few more slides, just visuals, and I don't know, I like seeing things over multiple years because it kind of shows you how you got where you are. But you can see in 2015-16 we were at 7.26 on the employer contribution, and we're at 13.5. So I think it's like 8 years we've almost doubled, and that's a required cost to the district. Extremely expensive, good for employees, but also very challenging for boards on restricted budgets to kind of meet those obligations. So continuing the required cost conversation, so we wanted to bring the insurance fund balance. It's, obviously since we went self-insured in 2013, we kind of were building up a balance, and we had a few bad years in terms of claims experience, and we're kind of rebuilding that fund balance. We presented to the board, I think last year, the idea of employee health clinics. So we have a insurance committee that meets monthly during the school year, is doing an off-cycle meeting in June to look at vendors that can potentially fill in staff, a health clinic, and then we would, after the input from the insurance committee in terms of what we're looking for as a district, would move forward with an RFP. Very sad I'm not going to be here for that because that's something I've really wanted for a long time. But I think ultimately, we looked at it. It makes a great deal of sense. We also feel pretty comfortable with where we are claims experience-wise. It's kind of stabilized since COVID, so we feel pretty good with a $13 million fund balance that we can absorb that additional cost and then hopefully at some point have some savings associated with that. Looking at historical insurance contribution rates, so these, when you think about insurance, the premium's on a calendar year, and then the cost is on a fiscal year, so those two don't align. So you have kind of like a blended rate where, for next year's budget, the first 6 months is going to be on the 23 rate, the second 6 months is going to be on the 24 rate. So these are kind of like blended costs, but again, kind of the same trajectory as FRS. Those required costs for us to provide the insurance has gone up. And we've had varying renewals over the last 8 years. And, obviously the years that we saw our fund balance dipping also correspond with pretty sharp increases to the rates. And how I've tried to advise the committee is like, you can't have a year where like we had in 2017-18, where we do 0% renewal, and then you follow that up with big renewals because we didn't do what needed to be done. So for next year, we're looking at a 4.2% renewal, which most counties would die for. That's really good. And it shows, an adequately funded health insurance plan with good participation, good claims experience, and a committee that's making good decisions. So the funds per FTE, I always kind of bring this because you see, these skyrocketing costs, and then you don't see the corresponding increase in per FTE funding. So we are going up for next year, which is great. We do have a lot of required costs that's going to really eat at that number, as we'll see. But a pretty good visual in terms of where we've gone, and the trajectory is not as good as it was for FRS in terms of the slope, but a little bit of progress this year. So moving on to the 1 mil funds, we've made some pretty drastic changes in our cost profile for the 1 mil this year, and I just provided a few years of data, but you can see for 2021, we had 18 million in revenue. The expenditures were a lot less for varying reasons. We had vacancies. We also didn't purchase classroom technology. Those are coming out of federal funds. For this year, we made significant changes to how we fund staff that's eligible to be funded out of the mill pursuant the financial recovery plan, which was kind of a Band-Aid, not a permanent solution. So as we roll into the next fiscal year, and I do want to point out to the board, we updated both this slide and the following one based on the updated property tax value, so it's going to look a little bit different on the 23-24 section, but we're pretty close to being where the estimated expenditures are, I think, within 200,000 of revenue, so it's not necessarily a situation where we're going to have massive excess. The opposite, most likely, but not as bad as it was when we sent it to the board originally because we were working on an old estimate for property tax values.
I had this in my notes here. I know the revenue is increasing for the mill, but we have more expenses that were shifted there as a result of the financial recovery plan, and that's made a negative impact on our fund balance. So in this preliminary budget that you have, are you sticking with that same funding model to fund additional, the increased costs for media and guidance counselors out of 1 mil?
We are. So that's the board-approved staffing plan. I think, there's certainly consideration that we could, have on, what the percentages are, how many positions we're funding, those sorts of things. But we went with what is in place at this time. And also just wanted to mention as we see increases in the property tax value, we're sharing additional funds with charter schools. And that's really, one of the big significant changes because we've had large, what I would consider percentage-wise, large revolving balances in the fund, and those have been decreased significantly. So the next slide really goes a little bit deeper, goes into the program level in terms of historical spend on school chorus, charters, and all the different things that we use to fund the mill. So it's got the total expenditures, and the expenditures from 16, 17 through 2021 are final, and for 22, 23, they're estimated based on current staffing levels, purchases made. And then you can see the net result at the bottom is the fund balance, which was increasing for a while. In 2021, we purchased, I think, 3.6 million in laptops. That was like right when the pandemic started. So we took a lot of those reserve funds that were there, used those for classroom tech, and then built it up a little bit last year. And then again, estimated to be around 800,000 this year. As we close out, that picture will be a lot more clear. And then we have a preliminary budget next year based on, as has been mentioned, the staffing formula and the staffing percentages of 23.8 million, which would give us on a budget basis a balance of 563,000, which is more than what we gave you yesterday. Yeah. So that's good. And I would say, this is budget also. It's not actual expenditures. We budget for all positions. We don't budget for laps and things that some of the bigger districts do. But, I anticipate, or I would expect there to be vacancies when we start the year. So I think, when you look at it, 500,000 is not a great deal of money, but it could be more than that depending on how much staffing we're able to get hired up at the beginning of the year.
Well, I guess, so my question would be for you, Mr. Burkett, and you, Ms. Ford, when you come back to us, the vacancy factor which is in there, because when we look at those, a lot of those positions, and I think guidance and probably media, I think the library programs, I'm not sure about music and art, most of them are usually, this is not where we're having our staffing challenges.
I think Dr. Edwards would probably disagree on guidance.
No, I'm saying that is one, guidance, that line, and we probably will. But the media, all the other lines, I think we're not having staffing challenges there. I'm expecting, I guess so my question would be is, what's the required fund balance for the mill? Is there anything in in our policy or amount we have to keep in reserve for that?
So there's no requirement in the ballot language or in the bylaws of the Oversight Committee. That's something that I have considered, or we have considered over the years. I did institute one for the health insurance fund, because that's a negotiated committee. We set that at 12 million. I would say, somewhere around 10% would probably be around best practice in terms of fund balance. So that would be, 2.3 million, somewhere in that range. 2.5 million.
So the 563,000 that's up there, that is for just that year. That's not the year to date. That's not inception to date, correct?
No, it's a rolling balance.
Oh, so that's a rolling balance right there. The five. So we're
mentioned that. Yes, it's a rolling balance. It's not a total balance. So it's end of the year. And again, it's budget, so it's not like final expenditures, but certainly tighter than I would want. I think what we're hoping happens, either we figure out a way to reduce expenditures, or the more likely thing is the tax roll catches up to where we can fund our required costs for staff and those things without making big programmatic changes in accounting for charter schools.
And you said 10% is kind of what you would recommend, right? That's what you've operated off of in the past, almost.
Well, I think that's a best practice, because you have to find the sweet spot between having an adequate reserve if it doesn't get renewed, or we have a budgetary crisis with not spending the funds, right? So we don't want excessive fund balance either. So 10% in my mind is a pretty good happy medium between those. All right, so moving on to staffing. This is the general fund budgeted staffing. And we've made a lot of changes to the budget committee in staff meetings in terms of reducing, making changes, programmatic changes, and shifting positions. So we're, for next year, propose very slight increase in instructional positions of 5.4, ESP positions slightly up at 8 additional units. Professional and technical, we did eliminate a bunch of vacancies that are professional and technical, and an increase of 1.5 FTEs in administrative. So total increase district-wide of five units essentially, which is percentage-wise incredibly small. And this is specifically general fund positions, this isn't federal.
So, Mr. Rella, I went back, in the last staffing report that I have from you is February 28. So I'm just saying, like, I compared this to that, and it differs. This is higher here.
So in terms of, and again, it's always, in my opinion, important to realize where kind of you're at in the budget process and doing a like-for-like comparison. So this is last year's budgeted staffing. We do have adjustments that are made during the year. Like, for example, some of our high schools pay for extra periods or additional teacher units out of advanced placement, IB. Those aren't always known at this time, so that's why it changes. So if you go back and look at like the original, it should be the original budgeted staffing. I think I pulled this off one of our slide decks from last year. That should be what was the total amount.
I guess I'm asking because here, like the instructional revised budget units is 1,892.84. And there, the 22-23, it's 1,884, right? Which is less than what's here. So are you saying the units that were paid for by the schools is taken out of that, but they're in here?
So they're typically added. So we have like a base instructional for all the different bargaining groups, and then they're added to the total. Sometimes there's also conversions. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that we do with staffing that makes it, difficult. I think what I did, or what we did, was pull last year's budget staffing from our presentations as a starting point, since that's where we're at now, and do the comparison to where we are at this point in the same general timeline. And then there's a lot of things that happen during the summer, schools purchase units and things like that change the numbers throughout the year, and we revise the budget staffing every
I
month.
guess for me then, I put together this worksheet from these, I put together a schedule to compare general fund units, instructional ESPs, PTs, administrative, federal units. And I did it for multiple years to see how our staffing was. And so my question was actually going to be, that I have here, is if our student enrollment is declining, our staffing should not be increasing. And that's the trend I'm seeing. So I want to make sure I'm using, like, where is the data? What's the source data that I can put my hand on and I can do that type of comparison? Because that's really important with where we are right now. And I use these staffing reports. I just went back, all the ones that have been emailed to me since I've been on the board. I got one from each of the year, like the latest one, and just that's what I did here. And I am concerned, I've said this to you, the budget committee meeting, I've said that in the budget committee meeting, that we can't be increasing staffing if the student enrollment, because there should be the correlation, right? We should, if our enrollment is going down, the amount of staffing that we have should be decreasing also, not increasing. So tell me where can I get good info that we can.
So I would certainly point you towards the first one we do at the beginning of the year. So that's typically like September-ish, and that should either align with what we presented in budget staffing or be very close. depending on what happened during the summer, because sometimes units change. Schools will switch out instructional for support staff in some instances and things like that. But the beginning of the year, it's always, again, it's good to compare when you're comparing data like staffing to use the same timeline every year, because stuff changes during the year and schools purchase units and things like that. That makes it more difficult. So the end of the year is typically more budgeted positions, but more vacancies also, because we stop hiring in March.
So if I was to use February or so for each year that I have here, would that be good, or would you recommend me going back and using beginning of the year being September, the one you just mentioned?
I would use the beginning of the school year.
Thank you.
All right, the next slide is the budgeted staffing, and this just incorporates the general fund and federal funds. So total staffing for instructional, 2,000 units, which is 51%. The educational support, 38%. Professional and technical support staff, 6%, and the administrative, 4%. So total budgeted staffing on an FTE basis of 3,900 employees.
Onto our ESSER and ARP staffing. The positions before you were discussed in several of our budget committee meetings. In light of ESSER 2 sunsetting September of '23, the following position funding has been decided. The following movement, excuse me. Again, I won't read it to you. I'm sorry.
The movement from ESSER 2 to ARP, has that been approved? Have y'all sent that to DOE and gotten it approved?
I believe we're unable to send amendments or continue further amendments until the initial one that was sent is approved first. Ms. Weiss?
All right, so the initial one, has that, because I had some questions about that when I remember pulling that off. We pulled that and voted on a future meeting. So has that been approved?
No, ma'am. They returned questions and feedback to us that Dr. Boker gave back to staff for those particular areas, and we'll have to resubmit Amendment 5. That we just got that feedback this week. So no, the short answer is no.
Thank you. So we have to, I don't know what the feedback is because I haven't seen it. I would love to see it though. I would. I think in light of that then to our finance team, I think we got to be real careful about every one of these positions up here. We got to we have to explain to the board so we can explain to DOE how these spots are going to improve and impact student achievement, or whatever the criteria for DOE is. Because right now we have a lot of salary that's on the federal grants for these positions right here, and if that's been kicked back, we got to almost expect that we're going to have the same thing to happen with this right here. Because I asked that question because I'm talking to my colleagues from around the state, and everybody's getting questions about their stuff, and they're getting tight. Like before, it was you had a lot of leeway, but it's tightening up, is what my colleagues from other districts are telling me that they're having. Because I was asking about are we getting feedback from DOE if we've submitted amendments, budget amendments, and they were asking me if they've been approved. That's why. And so when I looked at the slide deck this morning before coming here, and I saw that this differs from what was in we discussed this also in the budget committee meeting, but I'm seeing this movement from ESSER 2 to ARP. I
guess because we still have another year. I was looking at all these positions before. There were like 40, when there 40 total positions or something like that, Alex. And all of these were out of the ESSER and the ARP. I'm just looking at because I remember we looked at that when you and I met, which ones really impact, because there's some we just have to have, but so after the ARP runs out, we really got to look at these positions because these are affecting people losing jobs.
I
That
agree
was
with
the
you.
allocation.
I don't think we gotta, and I don't think the can could be kicked down the road, in my opinion, because if not, you're gonna either pay the piper this year and start making some adjustments in 23, 24, or next year it's gonna be a hard stop. You don't have a choice. So that's kind of like why I'm asking these questions. I asked these same questions in the budget committee meeting, but yeah, we gotta do something, so.
Why are we going to refund some of these jobs up here if we haven't seen if the data doesn't show the success that we're looking for? And do we have PM3 data that we could look at this point? Because the little bit that I've seen, it's not showing that these positions are making a difference, some of them anyhow.
Right, that's what I was saying. We created a lot of positions. I thought it was like 40. I'm not sure from the beginning. So it was like $5 million worth of positions, which didn't impact all the students. So where are we? You know, we really need to look at this because I'm still saying it's going to affect people. We really need to look at it because they were created, but that may have not been the best decision because this is temporary funding. That's one of the first things we learned in finance training. And so now that this is a concern and we really need to look at this. And then you're saying, yeah, we need to look at, so I don't know if we can come back, Madam Chair, at a future meeting, June 6th or the June meeting to really talk about this because this is,
Yeah, I think
it's people.
the cabinet level team and all that that's not finance. Finance is just making it.
Well, I'm just saying.
I think we're gonna have to have another conversation. I agree
Right.
with you. Because that's one of my questions, evaluation of existing staff and programs to determine continuing, what we're gonna continue to fund, you know, where we're gonna find funding. We gotta figure out a place for, we just heard like from the 1 mil and the 1.5 mil that there's like no space in our regular budget for anything else, right? We just had that conversation. That was kind of the my underlying theme of that is that our regular budget here, we gotta cut something out, and just for
And we know, right.
transparency, I've been saying we've met in the budget committee, when we've given, there was a discussion about from the principals of them, what they need in additional staff and like another dean at the high school level, so they have one at each level, right? So I'm not like against that, as I told them, but the next question that I said to them, so what are we going to cut so that we can fund this? Because we can't just keep adding on the scale on one side without taking something off, because we got to balance out. And in that meeting, nothing came up that we were going to cut. So, and I've asked that almost every meeting. They were like sick of me, but like, because we got to give up something. We got to figure out how we're going to reduce our expenditures so that we can not spend more than what the revenue that we have coming in, budgeted revenue. And right now, where we stand, this budget right here is spending more than what we expect to come in.
And I agree, but the other thing is too, on an optimistic note, we need to look at, we know we only gonna get so much from the state. We know that. We got our 1 meal, but that's why grants and other things are so important, building Medicaid for transportation. That's why you really gotta look at all of this, because Medicaid for our disabled students, if they're transportation, we haven't been building that. That's additional income that needs to be coming in. That's why it's so important. We got to start looking at outside the box, but also we got to look at what is really benefiting children. You know, well, we got a Department 5. Do we really need 5? I mean, but because the outcome is to make sure children are having the best education, because that's key. But when we created all of this, we created, back to that point, of $5 million worth of jobs, and just was not good to me. So, but I'm just saying, when we come back in the future, we really need to look at that. Thank you, Madam Chair.
So those of you that know me well, I'm really big on program evaluation. I think the difficulty finance and business services staff has is we can't do the program, like you do not want me doing program evaluation on all the different things. So that's kind of why we brought all these positions to the budget committee, which has the board chair, superintendent, all the chiefs, deputy to provide input, and this is the input. I think, we are, one of the suggestions I made, if we are going to eliminate positions, it's good to do that maybe this year and next year, so we're not necessarily eliminating them all at the same time. Ultimately, the priorities are the priorities, so this is kind of what we went with. I don't think this is, a discussion that needs to be over or should be over. I think, to kind of continue this as I leave. But there is opportunity to make adjustments, certainly to the federal grants, but that information, we need to start pulling that together if there's going to be a different direction quickly.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not just getting the state approval for it, but I'm really concerned with using different time-limited funds to pay for recurring positions. I don't think that's sound fiscally. I don't think we should do it. I think if we can't afford to pay for them, then we need to make some hard decisions about which ones to cut. So I'm just going to concur with my colleagues there.
Did I share that FAS report with you? The most recent one. I'll share it with you all. And there were some things, some recommendations that were made, and that's why a couple positions I know that are there, up there.
That one's the one from 2017, is that correct?
And there's the most recent one also.
Oh, there's a newer one. Okay.
I think 21, right? 21 or 22. One in there. So I'll give you both of them. You need to read both of them, yeah.
Skip ahead a little bit, and we'll come back for further direction. Ms. Wise.
Actually, so, I'm sorry, and you said you're going to come back for additional direction from the board. So I want to really, we got to kind of look to, we can all give like feedback, but I think what has been kind of communicated to me is that I think our superintendent, and we need a plan from him as to a proposal or some type of recommendation to guide this, because I don't want to bog this down from all the discussion we're in here, but as was told to me, the budget is the superintendent's budget until the board approves it. And so I've been asking for a reduction in workforce, reduction in expenses, or programs that we got to evaluate those things, and finance can't give. I've been asking finance for it, but I can't get it from finance. So, I mean, because they don't know the tenor of what is going to be proposed by our superintendent. So I think if the priorities of the board being improving student achievement, we had the development strategic plan. There's some priorities that we have to have and approve. That he tells us that, we told him we want student achievement, and he comes back and tells us how he plans to implement that. Then that's what we would fund budgetarily. And finance will put that together to bring to us to approve. Right now, we're just kind of rolling forward with what's been done in the past and trying to fund that. And I just don't, I think there's got to be some collaboration between the superintendent and finance staff to bring some stuff back to the board. I mean, that's what I see. I'm not sure.
Madam Chair.
Yes, ma'am.
One of the things that I would like to see, since Mr. Rella says that's very hard for finance to get involved, but you've got enough people in the other purview of instruction that they can give. I'm not willing to go on what we've done in the past. I'm willing to go on when we see the evaluation, how the programs have worked, because you cannot determine who is needed in the positions if we don't know what has taken place, period.
So Dr.
And we need to have that information before we come back.
I agree. Remember when the program evaluation won't come from Mr. Rella and his team. The program evaluation came. I got this big spreadsheet back in, I don't even remember the month now. I want to say February or March, from Dr. Edwards. You sent it to me when they were doing all of the ESSER and those budget amendments. Remember, and I said, wait, who's evaluating this? How do we know if this is effective? And there was an 11 by 14 sheet of paper that I got back that was things that it wasn't determined. You know, some things we got some feedback on, but on the different things that were being funded by that didn't come from finance. That came from other areas that had oversight of that. So I think we have to get, if you're asking for us to get that type of information from.
You're going to have it before you can start cutting positions.
I don't disagree with you. I'm just saying we're saying the same thing.
Okay.
I just don't, but what you, I'm only commenting because you were saying from Mr. Rella, program evaluation doesn't come from finance. I see Mr. Gilfillan at the podium there. I guess you got something you want to share with us?
Sure. This blocks the color, so I couldn't see if it was on. So I want to clarify, Ms. Surden, are you referring to the February 21st meeting where we shared the one-pager per all of the different amendments we had for ESSER, where we laid out the activity, reasonable, necessary monitoring and evaluation, next steps for implementation? Kind of looked like that. I don't know if you can see it from here. So that was presented in February as part of the amendment process because we were being required to submit those plans as we were submitting those amendments to DOE.
So I remember seeing that, but I think it was something after that, if I'm recalling correctly, because Dr. Edwards sent it. Am I correct in saying you sent me something else after that? Yeah. Right. Yeah, and I think several people input information into it. You didn't do it all, but it was sent to all of us. She didn't just send it to me. It was sent to everybody. It wasn't just to Tina. It was sent to everybody, but it was sent out. And I'm wondering, have you all updated that? Because that kind of guides this conversation also. I think as we are entering now today's the last day of school, wrapping up, and I'm not sure when you guys meet as cabinet, if y'all are discussing these things, would this work well, that didn't work well, we want to do more of this, less of this, my conversation I had every time we was in budget meeting.
It's probably different for the different departments. I know for some of the things we've had on the ESSER amendment, those like partnerships that we have with people, we have, like for instance, we have a meeting tomorrow with parentguidance.org. It is to do those things. We've made requests. So we don't have the feedback for final year because today is the end of the year, but that is part of the process for us. I would imagine it's the same for curriculum. We're just not at the point where we can see all of the final data for it, but I would imagine, in midsummer that would be an opportunity to be able to go back and look at all of those things because you have to get the data in, compile it, look at the evaluative pieces.
And I mean, that's like with program, that's what people, like we know the health nurses, the nurses and the health techs and all that, we know that those were hired up because of COVID and the needs that we had in the school system when we were doing that. Like, there's not a need to have that type of staffing, I think, at that level now, right? We have our school nurses. But I just think the evaluative process of that, having that information so that we can it's not, when we make the decision of what we're sunsetting, I mean, we're not going to fund anymore, or we're going to be trying to find a place for it in the general fund budget or the 1 mil budget or the federal funds budget. That helps us to have some type of baseline or reasoning for doing it where it's not just willy-nilly. Like, we're not just doing that. We can say, well, we looked at this, and these are the criteria or how we make those decisions.
When can we get student data? PM3, I mean, this is the last day of school, so PM3 has to be completed.
That is correct. The testing window for FAST was May 1st through May 31st, so you're correct. Today is the last window. The EOC windows for our EOC courses, Algebra 1, Geometry, our Biology, Civics, US History, Algebra 1 and Geometry, we should also have the results coming in today because those also tie into graduation. The other EOCs we're going to see towards the later of end of July or start of August because for one, some of the paper tests some of the science tests are paper-based, and those take longer to grade. But you're correct, we should have and able to do the results. And Mr. Andrew, I think, maybe has some guidance about when we're sharing that. I think that we have plans of sharing those results at an upcoming board workshop, but I don't want to speak for him.
I believe we added those to June 6th for the updates on the FAST.
I mean, is there any reason why you can't share them with us prior to June 6th?
Will you have those prepared, Mr. Gilfillan, prior to the 6th?
Yeah, we have the rolled up results ready to go. I mean, and part of the reason we wanted to wait to June 1st anyway is in our ABC reporting, May 31st is also the last day of the month, so that also ties up our attendance data, our behavior data, and our core academic data. So there's no reason I think we could have it as early as tomorrow. It's going to be in a very similar format that we've already repeated just because it's plug and play. So I don't think there's anything permitting us. I think there's probably just some things that we want to go through and be clear on. I think for one, for example, students who tested at schools is not necessarily the same students that are going to count for schools in terms of their school grade. So students who were both enrolled on the Survey 2 and Survey 3 date and haven't withdrawn from their school between Survey 3 and the start of testing, those will count for the school grades. We're welcome to share the data. I think my only question I'd either ask of Mr. Andrew or to clarify with the board is, are we looking at all of our students who tested, regardless of how they're going to count for schools? Are we looking for the students who will count for schools in terms of their school grades? That would maybe be my only caveat that I'd want to learn more about before we would go ahead and share and prepare that.
I think we should have both.
And by school also.
Right, down to grade level by school.
And subgroups, that's what's important.
Correct. Thank you, Mr. Gilfillan.
Well, I have the good fortune of talking about one of our ESSER-funded projects, which was high-dose tutors. We did spend a considerable amount of time in Budget Committee talking about this specifically, although I'll say there's other things listed on here, like a teacher specialist for UFly and a teacher specialist for K-8 math, where program evaluation can be tricky if they haven't been able to do that work the entire time. For instance, if they're assigned to teach for part of their day, so then would we be looking at the data for a short period of time that they were the teacher or the K-8 across the district? When their schedule that they had from the beginning of the year wasn't able to be maintained, that becomes a little trickier. And for a good number of our high-dose tutors, that is the same situation. We found that due to vacancies and substitute shortages, that in our elementary schools who had 2 high-dose tutors who were originally hired as behavior para 2s, and our secondary schools had 1 high-dose tutor, that in the places where they were, their time was protected and they were able to do high-dose tutoring, and those students were identified and received the high-dose tutoring with the right materials at the right intensity, at the right frequency, made great improvements in their fluency specifically. But in the places where the high-dose tutors were more often than not having to cover classes or provide supervision for when there wasn't an adult available, those results do not look as good. So we will be wrapping up our final data analysis for high-dose tutors across the district. There was discussion in Budget Committee, and we did also have elementary, middle, and high school principal reps there about schools having more flexibility in the way they use these personnel based on the data of their school and their progress towards the district ABC goals, whether that was behavior, attendance, or core curriculum. And for some schools, the behavior needs are so intense that they would hope to be able to use their person to support and intervene more proactively with student behavior. And I believe you were sending out a survey and asking schools what data were they using to decide was the most impactful way to use these employees so that we could, number one, train them and make sure, if you're a high-dose tutor, that you're very familiar with the curriculum materials and how that program is supposed to be done, or if you're a behavior para, what you're supposed to be doing to support student behavior. And then we've identified the right students, and we're tracking the progress that they're making with those students. So going forward into next school year, if the funding source had been changed from ESSER 2 to ARP, that would be an amendment, which means we have to reallocate something that was on ARP that hasn't been spent down or isn't being as effective as we think the high-dose tutors or behavior para 2s could be.
Thank you, Ms. Wise. And just to fill my colleagues in, I raised a concern because we had a large number of employees budgeted here in the dollar amount, and I was asking a question about their impact. And Ms. Wise, not just Ms. Wise, but the principals shared that they weren't always hot tutoring. And I was like, that's fraud because, well, we've been asking that, yeah.
Question about how those tutoring, are they really performing in the capacity that they were hired in? And that-
So they were hired as behavior paras because they said behavior para was easier to hire than the para 2 because you don't have to have the 60 college credit hours and you pass the para pro 2 test. I'm going from memory here, right?
Yes, ma'am. So originally, when the district had behavior para 2s, I believe they were funded on IDEA, and that was a new job description that paid them at a para 2 level, but they didn't have to have the 60 hours or the para pro test. When a previous superintendent made a decision to shift the work of the behavior para 2s to providing high-dose tutoring to address learning loss, that was exacerbated during COVID. A lot of those people, like you say, the reason they applied for and competed and were awarded the jobs they had is because they specifically wanted to work on behavior and not necessarily be academic tutors. So we have been providing training. There has been some attrition, and as principals were hiring up the high-dose tutor behavior para 2, they were letting the person know that that's what they would be doing. But it isn't clean. I would also add, with your permission, Mrs. Certain, that the committee did talk about the need for a high-dose tutor job description so that what the employees were doing more closely matched their job description.
Yeah, thanks for saying that. I was going to say that as well, so that when we do the budget for this particular grant going forward, or people look at it, and we're saying we use high-dose tutors, but the point I was making to them, we want to say we spent so many millions of dollars on high-dose tutors, and that there's been no academic improvement. And people will say, well, you spent all this money on that, when really that's not what they were doing. They were substituting, and they were helping with behavior interventions. They weren't tutoring. So they aren't reflected in the grant correctly. So we don't really want to continue to do that. We have to have a job description, and job descriptions take rulemaking and all that stuff, but that's what we got to do so that we can hire people for what they want. And so a couple of the principals said that, especially an elementary principal, that some people could be trained to follow the directions and to do the tutoring on whatever it was. I don't recall the program. You all recall that. You can say that. But Great Leaps, I don't know what it was that they were doing, but she said that she's met people that they can follow the directions, they can be trained, and they can tutor it, and they could help people. But I just think it's not clear, and I don't want to say deceptive because I don't think that's the intent of anybody, but it's not clear when we look at these grant applications, like somebody was to go back 5 years or 2 years later and say, oh, well, they said they spent this amount of money on high-dose tutors, but the student achievement hasn't improved.
Right, because they weren't being used properly. I mean, that's one of the questions I asked from them, because we wouldn't have known as the ones who just arrived on the board, but that should be known. That should be explained. And if it couldn't be used for that, why did we use it for that in the beginning? I mean, if we couldn't. I mean, I'm just saying, whatever the rule, they give you guidelines when you follow these things. And so we just need to make sure we're following those guidelines.
Agree, yeah.
Okay.
I think we have to have create job descriptions, and that takes time. Like, that's the teacher specialist. We have that teacher specialist, in my opinion, because previous folks were lazy. They took the easy way out to use a generic job description. The people are doing the work.
Generic gets us in trouble.
But
Generic gets us in trouble.
Yeah. So that's that. All right, go, Miss Ford, unless there's any other comments or questions on that. But I do want to know, like, how did they say that they say high-dose data supports student gains when high-dose tutors is protected? Like, in the meeting, the budget committee meeting, no one shared how they knew that happened. So we need to know how that happened. Like, I mean, you can't tell me that, but now I know. But we do need to know how they can make that.
But I think what would be helpful, Madam Chair, as we move forward, just like now, and previous things we're doing with rezoning, the people who are actually doing those jobs every day, they need to come with the lead person, so we would know. And I think that would help make sure we're all communicating together so that we would know. Because because I asked that question, and the lead person tells me how we're using those tutors or who's monitoring it, but the person who's actually working with it was sitting in the room. And see, if we don't have the information, I'm just saying, moving forward, just like Alex has a team here, Mr. Rella has a team. If we get everybody to the table who actually is doing that, because you got a department, but there are people working in there, that may help us so that we don't have these kind of things, or we make sure we have all of the information when we're making decisions. I'm just saying, moving forward. Thank you.
Do we have one person that's overhire those tutors? I thought the principals hired.
We do.
Oh, okay.
That's
No,
why.
we have a staff member who supports training the high-dose tutors, Candace Davis.
Thank you for that.
Well, I think we can all agree that we are going through some challenging budgetary times right now. Of course, again, we are in the midst of the guessing game as far as projected FTE. So of course, we can't reduce schools or teachers at this time without having proper FTE counts. So each department has been closely evaluated to see what revisions to FTE could occur, whether to eliminate or include. Again, I will not read every line to you, but some of the budgetary impacts before you, the deputy superintendent position will be returning to the, I believe returning, am I saying that right? Excuse me, returning to the general fund from ESSER 2 funding, which will sunset September 2023. And then another addition would be the benefits program service specialists in anticipation of the clinic as another addition to the budget, and then you'll see the reductions or eliminations before you.
You said the benefits program services specialist, and then, what's that position?
So we discussed internally, because, obviously we're going to bring on a health clinic. That's going to be significant work for the benefits office, which is a very small but mighty 2 people. So taking on this additional role is probably they're already stretched really thin, and we want to provide A+ customer service as always. So we're going to need to have someone to help assist with that. We just plugged in the program service specialist. I'm not sure if the direction is going to be to have a separate job description. I think that would be ideal to do that. And we have time to do it. We kind of just wanted the budgetary placeholder, and we wouldn't fill this position, well, I don't think we would fill this position any point in the next few months. We just need it budgeted, so when we do, we are ready to go live, we have the budget and the position in place, and that does give us time to do the role making for a job description if we want to.
Can we let's take a 10-minute break so we can, and we'll come back and pick up, okay? Thank you. go ahead and come on back together and let you guys resume. Thank you. I did have one question. I see the social workers on here been removed from the federal funding. Y'all, how those gonna be funded? 19 social workers, are you gonna drop them? Oh, okay, all right. You know, at the supervisor for mental health, you had it designated ARP/MHA, and here, social workers I asked because you just had it removed, and that's why I was asking.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Wrapping up our general fund departmental staffing, the net reduction in staffing is 852,000.
I have a question about on the previous slide about the TSA for behavior. I was just wondering what that was. I mean, obviously, it's a TSA for behavior, but is there a reason why we're adding that, or?
It was part of what was approved in our ESSER amendment, and so we actually had 2 TSAs for behavior that were listed there to support district-wide in schools, the behavioral concerns that we had.
Do y'all have like a job description for that? Can we put them in a job description instead of it being the teacher on special assignment for that?
I would be happy to, if you want us to bring them through the board and go through the rulemaking for each of the,
We need a job description for that, because for the teacher, I think for all of these, the catch-all job descriptions, teacher and special assignment, program analyst, all that, I think we have to do that. That hasn't been done in the past, but I think so that what they will be doing, the duties and responsibilities of the position are clearly outlined and not just on a TSA, because there's just, that's a catch-all.
Yeah, that would be helpful for me, so.
Does that 86,000 include benefits, or is that just the salary?
Go ahead, Ms. Rowe.
So yeah, all position costs is going to include benefits and salary, correct? All right, so jumping ahead to temporary staffing services, as we know, the board approved the contract for ESS, Educational Staffing Services, I think at the last board meeting. And we've had a lot of discussion with them and had a chance to do some benchmarking around the state in terms of what different districts are paying their subs. We do have the requirement to be at $15 an hour minimum wage for our employees. This group is not subject to it because they're contracted services. However, the reality of the job market is such that we feel like it would be important to increase those to be in line with other counties and be in line with kind of the reality of our financial situation in terms of being competitive. So what we've done here is we weren't able to get good data from our previous vendor. So we actually went back to 1920, which is our last like full non-COVID year, and pulled the annual absences, and then used our current fill rate percentage for our previous vendor, which is 76%, and then you can see our current hourly rates for high school diplomas 11, associates 12, bachelors 13, retired teachers 15. You can see the estimated cost for this year around 1.2 million. So the proposal is to move the high school associates and bachelors all up to 15, and then have a $16 differentiation for our retired teachers. We're also estimating an increase in fill rate based on the increase in pay and potentially performance from the new vendor of 85%. So if you kind of use the same data, that would move us up to 12,076 absences filled, and when you include the markup, it is around 1.7 million. We do budget 1.4 for temporary staffing for teachers. Obviously, we're under that budget now because we're not filling the vacancies, and that's incredibly impactful for our schools. So it's one of those things where, the question is, does the board want to invest in that? There's a cost associated, but there's also a really significant operational cost for the schools. And we talked a little bit about the high-dose tutors, but in general, it's really chaotic for a school to fill teacher vacancies, daily vacancies that don't have a sub, and it cripples them on certain days. So this is kind of the proposal. It's not subject to negotiations, as we know. We wanted to get a feel for the board, and I know the vendor that would really help their recruiting efforts, and we've been able to obtain a lot of contact information from the subs they were providing. So if we provide, they were able to contact and say, hey, by the way, you're also going to get a big raise, come work for us. That would certainly help. There's budgetary impact around $400,000. It is budgeted and everything you have here in terms of the budget information, but it could certainly be pulled back if that's the desire. But we want to get a sense, and obviously we're not voting today, but get a sense for if the board would like to see those increases incorporated within the budget.
So when we say we're paying them 15 an hour, is that what they really get if we're going through an agency, or?
Right, so we contract with a vendor that provides the services. They do all the onboarding, fingerprinting, background, all that stuff. They also pay the FICA and W-2s, and they do all that stuff. So we determine the pay, which is what the subs get paid. There's a markup on top of that of 29.5% that they use to cover their overhead. They're going to have 3 dedicated employees, and they have, employee-associated costs just like we do for FICA, mandatory
So
Medicare.
where is that cost reflected in the budget? I mean, is that reflected in there, that
Yes.
29%?
Yep, the markup is in both of these, correct? Yep.
So, Mr. Rella, as I said last week, or in executive session, I'm in favor of increasing the pay rate, because if we want to get subs to fill the spots, we kind of got to match what the market is around us. The consensus of the board, we only have $1.4 million budgeted right now for a substitute, and of course, looking at what they're estimating this could cost, it's an estimate $1.7 million. It's like $300,000 more, but hopefully people will be at work this year and they won't be out as much. So it may be a moot point. But if we don't have subs in, if teachers are out, staff is out, and we can't fill the sub positions, we have heard how negatively that impacts operations. So you all here, we can give our feedback to them now so that they know which way to go forward with telling the ESS, the vendor. Dr. McNeil, you okay with the 15 for everyone and the $16 for retired teachers? You're not?
No, ma'am. I think if you're raising like $2 or $3 more under the 23-24, I think the retired teachers certainly deserve more than $1 increase.
Okay. If I had it, I could agree with you. Okay, but.
So when you look, I appreciate that feedback. When you look at the numbers, that's not a huge group in terms of absences, so estimated like 341. So, increasing that $1 an hour, let's just say hypothetically like 17, that's not going to be, a significant increase, and could really help the product, which is the kids in the classroom, because they know the classroom management and all those things. So that's the kind of feedback we want. Just if we could have some kind of consensus on a dollar amount, and we'll move forward.
Yeah, I agree with Dr. McNeely.
But what are you suggesting?
I would go 17 for the retired teachers, and honestly, I wish we could go 16 for the bachelor's degree, but I don't think we can because that's the largest group and budget's tight, but I wish we could.
Dr. McNeely, did you have a suggestion? I was just asking. Dr. Rockwell gave hers. I said, did you have a suggestion?
Dollar amount for suggestion for the retired.
For the retired.
Oh, if I can give it
Yes.
and not put you in the hole.
You can give it, don't mean we're going to follow it, but you.
Oh, okay. Well, $3 more.
Oh, 19, you saying?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, Okay, did you have an amount, Ms. McGraw, you wanted to suggest?
I mean, it's retired, educated. I'm okay either way. She said 19. Can you do it?
What we gonna give up?
So, right, so I mean,
Well,
Madam Chair, yeah, maybe if we did a 13 for high school, 14 for associates, you're 15, and then take your retired to 19? I don't know.
I think the base should be 15 even for the high school, because it,
17.
I mean,
and the problem is, Madam Chair, you're not going to get the retirees in here anyway, so it's just on paper.
and I'm sorry, I should have mentioned the benchmarking we did. Most districts kind of collapsed all those into $15 an hour. I mean, there's some exceptions to that, but most of them had, regardless of the education level, 15, and then some of them had, you know, additional $1 or $2 an hour for retired teachers. So that was pretty consistent.
15 and 17, it sounds like it.
That's fine, 17.
All right, I'm getting head nods, so we'll move forward unless there's more thoughts from Dr.
No,
McDonald.
I was just going to say, everybody that I have seen during graduation time, retired teachers, they just laugh in my face. So that's why I said up it, but they're not coming under the conditions that our schools are in now, period.
If you don't mind, can we go back to the previous slide, because I think I misspoke, and I don't want to give wrong information to the board. So when we look at the Student Services TSA behavior, I realize that that's not ARP, and it's only one. So is that ALC?
So this was in some changes that we made with the reorganization of ESE and Student Services, and I presented that to the Budget Committee, I think last month or the month before that. So I think it could have been ALC, it could have been a position maybe that was funded out of IDA, I don't specifically recall. But these are all general funded positions.
So just for you all to know, it may be the TSA for behavior here in this particular staffing is the person who would be serving in our alternative learning center. I would look to, is that correct, Ms. Black? Because what we had in the ARP were 2 TSAs that were specifically placed in ESSER. But so looking here, we have a TSA behavior in ALC though, correct? I think that's what that position is. And I just wanted to clarify because I didn't want to give you more. It's separate. That's a position that was in our general fund, the TSA, what we have now in ALC, but the other 2 were what were funded for district support that would have come out of ESSER. So that was in addition to.
I ain't feeling that, but okay, would you send me the number of students like we did before it was at a midpoint through the end of the school year?
Yes.
Thank you. Send us.
Yeah, but the other thing is, we just have to make sure we're not, when it comes to that behavior, after we talk to Mr. Andrew, with Quinn and everything, we gotta make sure.
All right, so the next couple slides, one of our largest line items in the budget is energy usage. And we have some information from Synergistic in terms of our base year, the first year of the program, second year of the program. So the green line is the second year, and this is KBTUs, so it's kilowatt hours plus BTUs. It's like a converted using both natural gas and electric, and I'm not smart enough to probably explain that well enough, but it's basically, an energy usage metric. So you can see our usage and utilization is down, which is certainly, really good. When you go to the next slide, one of the issues we're running into is the electric rates. We've seen these massive increases, not just in GRU, but also in FP&L, clay, et cetera. So the reduction in KBTU has not kept pace with the rate increases. So that's really caused issues budgetarily, and we're going to go back to the previous slide.
When you get done with the utilities, Dr. McNeely had a question on the previous slide, but I wanted you all to get done with this
Okay.
right here, and then we'll go back, okay? I got a
Right,
slide.
so when you look at the budget for utilities, we budget based on the previous year, calendar year spend. So you can see, for the current year, we budgeted 9.3. And the actual calendar year spend for the 22 year, which is kind of what we base the budget on, it's 10.6 million, and then we're projected based on the rate increases that are known and estimated at this time for the utilities budget to be close to 12 million, which is a $2.6 million increase. It is, one of those required expenses that is really challenging. And, obviously we don't control the rates, we control the use, and they've been making progress, but still probably not where we thought we would be at this time. And I'll open it up for questions.
I don't have any utility questions. Does anyone have any questions on utilities? We realize that it's, our usage is decreasing, but the rates are increasing at a faster pace than we're decreasing, so we're not seeing a decrease in cost to us. Dr. McNeely had a question on a prior slide. Dr. McNeely, would you tell them when they get to that slide that where you?
You're on let's go to the general fund staffing changes. I do apologize to go back. I looked under one of my favorite areas, transportation, and I did not see the I think it's called, we would have to have a job description, the assistant to the transportation director. That's so needed with all of the things that came up this year, and we need to have that kind of support.
So I will say a couple things. One, when we reviewed staffing, we started with vacant positions. So the positions that are on this sheet, for the most part, are not filled positions, or they're vacant. There's certainly opportunity as we move forward into the budget cycle and into the summer, if we need to realign positions. There's an opportunity to do that. I know transportation is a really dynamic and changing place right now, so we'll, with Director Jones' input and the superintendent's input, can
Director
shift.
Jones, don't you have something to say? I'm sorry, Madam Chair.
Oh, it's on. Madam Chair, school board members, superintendent, those are positions that some people either retired or we didn't hire in those positions. We are looking to make cuts to everything except bus drivers and bus attendants. We do need a assistant director. I think that's a very, very important position. We're looking to realign kind of job descriptions as well as what jobs people are doing in the office. We are looking at if it's going to benefit the transportation department and those jobs. We're looking at everything.
Mr. Jones, a few slides back, it's page 29. You have the manager of special projects for transportation, and that's grant funded, so time limited. What does that person do, and would you need that to be funded out of the general fund when these grants sunset?
That job right now, it's kind of FTE. After looking at it the past 2 years, I don't think we need that job, especially with us hiring a mapping router. It's kind of the same type job, kind of aligned. And if we have the mapping person, then I don't think we would need that job.
Okay, thank you.
And you've hired the mapping position, is what you're saying? That's a filled position already?
That's a position that I actually put a name in for, but I don't think they've hired them yet. I did make an offer through the HR department.
So it's not a new position, it's all.
No, that's not a new position. That's a person that retired, and but we do need that position. That edits the map, does the FTE.
Thank you. Thank you. I don't have anything else on those slides. We can scoot it on forward.
Does that mean we need to fund that position for next year if Mr. Jones is saying that he doesn't need that person, or?
That's a down there question. That's not, I mean, that's what they're gonna do with that position.
We're on page 29. We can review that, the ESSER 2.
Yeah, the last position on that page.
We can review that position as well. Like Mr. Rella had mentioned, a lot of this is everything, every position on here we can look at and make adjustments to and reduce at this time, or freeze, or do whatever it is that we decide to do. But we could freeze on some of these positions too, as far as refilling them if we're looking to cut back. And I know we are, so I think that's an option we have too, as these positions become vacant, all of them that are listed, we determine whether they need to be filled or not, or can we move forward.
I'm sorry, just one more note on transportation, because I remember I owed the board some kind of analysis on how much the changing of the start time for the schools and I think that ended up being around $60,000. So in the grand scheme of things of improving that operation, really negligible. And we also carry lots of vacancies for bus drivers, so I feel comfortable that expense is budgeted. And I wanted to make sure while I'm here, I mentioned that because we owed you that piece. So.
Are we considering that going forward since the cost is negligible? Is that?
I would defer to the superintendent. I think that's the sense that I get, but.
Correct. We're looking at not major changes there, but we were looking at some minutes changes where appropriate.
And I think earlier drop-off times at some schools where it made sense, but you're adding 5 minutes to a driver's route for 180 days, so the cost isn't significant. Okay. In some of them, there was no cost.
I think, if I'm recalling correctly, wasn't there impact like to have supervision at the schools? Is that included in the $60,000 also?
It is. I think there was 4 schools, and for some reason, my internet is going in and out. I don't have access to my files. But the early drop-off, I think it was like an additional 30 minutes for a paraprofessional at each of those schools, which I believe is what we did last school year. And we had just added 30 minutes to one of the staff members' time, and again, 30 minutes on the grand scheme of things is really small cost.
And before we go on that, Mr. Andrew, I noticed on there, here we were getting rid of the EA in the school security office, and I was wondering, I stopped and asked Chief Pelton how many people were in his department, and I'm wondering if we are, with all of the paperwork and stuff that we have and things in that office that had to be done, if we've cut them down bare bones where they're able to comply with all of the things that the legislature is requiring of them. And with there being new legislation out, we're sunsetting this, are you proposing cutting out the executive assistant? Are you proposing putting something else in there that can help with the threat assessments and all of that stuff, the required work that they have to do in that department?
Chief Pelton, would you come up and share with us? So I don't know that he needs another EA in there, but we've had some discussions of perhaps another position.
In the new Senate Bill 150, House Bill 543, there is a requirement in there now that for the new threat assessment process, the best practice is going to be to have a threat assessment coordinator. one of the requirements. It's similar to how there's a mental health coordinator for that component. It's a threat assessment coordinator.
Thank you. I asked because I didn't see like any corresponding plus. I saw a decrease in the office, but I didn't see a plus. And I know adding something, we have to figure out where we're going to cut. But if that is required to comply with state law, and we all, you may not know, but I mean, the Department of Education with all the security stuff can just wreak havoc. So we have to do the cost cutting, but I think we also got to make sure we're able to give him the staffing that he needs to do what he has to do for our 38 district-run schools and then the charters that we have the responsibility to oversee.
Yes, ma'am, and a corresponding job description on that as well. Have to be brought
Definitely. I have a job description. All right, I think we're done. We'll go back to where we were. Was it page 37? Slide 37?
Yes, general fund budget highlights regarding salaries. Again, we are comparing like data, the 2022-23 approved budget compared to our 23-24 preliminary budget. So for the administrative salaries budgeted at this time, there's an increase of 137,000. It is important to note that the 22-23 approved budget did not include any raise packages, position changes, nor did it include the negotiation changes with TSIA for that year. Moving down to our aides and paraprofessionals, and other support personnel, you'll see a dramatic increase there, and that is the increase for the $15 minimum wage requirement. So for our general fund budget highlights for salaries, an overall increase of $5.3 million.
I want to make sure I understood. You said the 22-23 approved budget didn't have the negotiated raises in there, the $15 raise, the TSIA, none of that was in there. It was just straight, I think I remember this here.
So it would have, for last year, would have included the pot of money we had for TSIA, similar to what we have for next year. But we negotiated above that, and we also didn't incorporate the $15 minimum wage, which I think the combined increase over what was available was like 2.6 million, I want to say. When I looked at our previous bargaining slides a few weeks ago. So it wouldn't have incorporated, it would incorporate the TSI money allocated by the state, but not anything above that. And nothing for the minimum wage.
Okay. And did it have the step in there, the 1% step increase? That's automatically in there?
Yeah, so what we do is I won't get into the weeds, we give everyone a step. We increase the FRS rates, insurance rates, we budget for vacancies. So basically every staffing cost that we can attribute or is known, we put in there, and then that's what we kind of use to base the budget on.
So the preliminary budget has those things and the TSIA that we know that we're getting. Okay, thank you.
Moving on to our next slide with employee benefits. Mr. Rella has already spoken regarding the increases for FRS retirement. Social Security has an increase as well, and that, of course, increases with salaries. Health insurance, so an overall employee benefit increase with the budget for $5.1 million, for a total of $5.1 million, excuse me. Again, I just want to point out the column headers. This is, again, comparing 22-23 approved budget, again, to our preliminary current budget for 23-24. These are our general fund appropriations. Just to point out a few before you, the increase in purchase services. That increase is mainly in part for the charter pass-through funding and the substitute rate increases that were proposed to you earlier. There's also a decrease on the other expense line, and that is the corresponding decrease due to charter school capital funds no longer being provided by the state, and that was paid out of our 7,000 object. Not that matters.
And just one more note on that, the purchase services also includes the 1.7 million in property casualty insurance increase for next year.
Is it, Ms. Ford and Mr. Burkett, when we come forward to do this again, I know that it is in the book that the charter pass-through is in the purchase services, but could we bring that amount out, state that separately, so that it just doesn't look like that's just an increase in that, on that line there? Like, kind of like what I was talking about earlier, like have an above the line and a below the line type thing where we can see what is like directly district and then the amounts that's going straight out, you know, for that. I think that is really, needs to be clear to the general public of how things are, what stays in with the district and increases and decreases, and then what goes out, you know, because.
It is also included on the preliminary budget summary that we provided. There is, which column are we in?
Oh, you're talking about
16.7 million. That's budgeted for distributions to charter schools. But yes, we will include it on the presentation.
Yeah, I think when this stuff that's forward-facing and that the public sees, I think it should be shown and it should be very clear what is not staying with the district. You know, what's charter, what's private, what stays with the district, so we can know, you know, it's like folks will see that huge increase. Hey, I got $30 extra million. You don't see all that's going out. We don't have that. And I think that'll be not just for our negotiations with, you know, with union, but just for general knowledge to the public with folks looking at that. And I think it would be helpful to me going forward too.
So for our general fund appropriations, that is a total of 20.3 million in increases.
And we wanted to go through, and we've been through most of this, but just so the board understands with the additional funds, there are a lot of additional required expenses. We've already gone through the salaries, the FRS rate, health insurance, and other fringes. We've talked about the property casualty insurance increase of 1.7 million, the add-on FTE, which is the the additional funding we get for Cambridge, IB, advanced placement, and CAPE. So we've a couple things going on there. One, the CAPE FTE has gone up a lot, which is really good. So kudos to Ms. Ritter and her team and all the teachers. But it's funded based on the base student allocation. So when the base student allocation goes way up, so does the funding. So that's funds that will be distributed throughout the year, but we have to budget for it on the front end. And then utilities of 2.6, teacher salary increase, again, which is budgeted for the district portion at 2.3. The mental health allocation, there was an increase there, which we have to budget for similarly with Safe Schools. We made some adjustments to school budgets, as we talked about in, I think it was March, when we were going through the custodial allocations and realizing just how far behind we were allocating to actual costs. The charter district disbursements going up 2.7. The temporary staffing, which we just talked through, of 400,000, and fuel costs around 200,000. So additional required costs, 22 million. There were some reductions that were made along the way, but that, it's a significant required costs with very little room to adjust unless we're reducing staffing or, not giving substitutes additional pay, things like that. So kind of wrapping up the budget portion, we did want to share just like some high-level things that the board needs to be thinking about as we roll into the next school year. But the real challenges, in my opinion, or our opinion, come the following year. And this is probably not an exhaustive list, but a pretty good list of things that we need to be thinking about and the potential impacts. Of course, vouchers, and just in general, like when we're looking at budget, you guys know I don't just look at this year. I'm always thinking 2-3 years down the road, because that's how you have to work in terms of budget. But, you know, we've got the vouchers, universal vouchers. We don't really 100% know what that's going to do. The School of Competitive Excellence is going to have an impact. There's always a potential of new charter schools. The legislative decisions that are made in terms of funding and operations and kind of the stuff we're required to do is difficult to predict at times. And there are a few things that, you know, like a summer school is a good example where we budgeted those out of ESSER funds. Historically, it's always been general, but since we had the ESSER funds, we needed to spend them. We do these really great summer programs and expand them. Well, the funds run out for next year, so when we're rolling into 24-25, if we're going to continue summer school, which we are, I'm sure, we're going to have to budget that in general. The ESSER ARP staffing, which we've talked about, that's like $5.5 million for next year. We've talked that one to death, so I'll let that go. We're always, you know, apprehensive as we approach the 1 mil approval. That's in 2024. The 1 mil fund balance is something that the board needs to be, and the superintendent need to be keeping an eye on. The technology refresh, that's going to be a difficult one because we haven't been appropriating the 1 mil funds to pay for that. We rolled it all into federal funds. We've also significantly increased the number of devices we have, and every device has a shelf life. It's not a one-time cost when you buy a computer. It's, you know, $1,000 every 5 years. So without those federal funds, in my discussions with Ms. Wise and Ms. Shankar, you know, I think we're going to have to look at utilizing some of our capital funds potentially. I know UMA is coming up with a multi-year plan on what that looks like, and we're going to have to backfill with funding sources, but the 1 mil can't handle it anymore entirely. So that's just something as we go forward, we need to be thinking about. And just in general, staff recruitment intention, that's not a new thing, but always a challenge. So this isn't like an exhaustive list. This is everything we could come up with in the 15 minutes before we submitted this to the board. But a pretty good list of high-level things that are important that the board needs to be thinking about as we roll into next budget cycle.
Any questions for Mr. Rella, Ms. Ford, Mr. Burkett?
Okay, so that's it on the budget piece. We did want to bring back the student fees and fines. So in February, we created 2 policies. Policy 6152 defines what a student fee is, and you can kind of, I think the board's already seen this, they've already approved it, and we brought this through the budget committee and just kind of defining what it is, instructional materials, school property, field trips that are required as part of curricular activity, and all those things, graduation fees. And there's a lot of stuff that's excluded, library, fines, charges for class rings, things that aren't really required. And so that's the 6152 defines what a fee is. 6152.01 is the waiver of fee policy. So this is the one that is kind of problematic, or not problematic, but something that's become really impactful for our schools. So basically, it says when fees can be waived. So anytime a student qualifies for free lunch, students experiencing homelessness, families who have suffered significant loss of income, and other good and just reasons determined by the superintendent. And there's a notification requirement. We have to notify parents annually that this exists, and there'll be a process and procedure in place. So I think the waiver piece, we did receive a lot of feedback from principals because, you know, some of our extracurricular sports teams at some schools are really heavy on the free and reduced lunch. So there was a lot of apprehension, like how are we going to fund our football team at Eastside next year? How are we going to do, band and all these things? And we don't necessarily have like recommendations on policy changes in here. I'm sure this is something that the superintendent and staff will work on. But on the next slide, you get a little bit of a sense of the scope of the potential impact. So and these are all of our sports teams, and I think we eliminated sports under 10. And this is just the ones with 60% free and reduced lunch and up. And you can see it's free and reduced lunch, but if you look at the percentages on the side, we don't have many reduced lunch students. It's only 8%. Most of them that participate are free. So I think the concern from the principals is how are they going to fund these programs if it's allowable and the parents can apply for it. I mean, I think there's an expectation there. I think every school's kind of had a different way of doing this, whether they have volunteers, whether they have fundraisers that the students participate in. But there's never been just like a blanket waiver. And I think
So, Mr. Rella, so you don't have to struggle over that, I actually, when I did agenda review at the end of that, I told Mr. Andrew we need to bring this back. I remember us having this conversation in the budget committee meeting so that we can revise this policy to take off the fees for extracurricular activities and fair share, to revise that. Because the district can't afford to fund all of those, and the schools can't afford to fund them, and the students and their parents are paying for that. So where you have schools, as you can see that chart there, that was an unintended consequence. I can't believe I didn't see that. So, and that would, other districts don't have, they have a 6152, but extracurricular activities are not included in that. So we're discussing this now, and I agree with the principals that brought it back when I was almost horrified that we had that in there. So that is something that's going to come back before us, or should come back, I think should come back before us for us to revise that. So, yep. For sports, because the thing came up with not just the football and basketball, but like the band that take these trips that are out of state that cost thousands of dollars, and if you've got students who can't go, like that, someone would have to raise that money or pay it for those students, and the parents are doing that. So, yes, ma'am, Ms. Dr.
A lot of sports, so help me with this. A lot of the sport activities for the kids, it's not listed, like swimming and track and golf. What about those?
So I guess I was trying to like demonstrate.
Oh, demonstrate. Okay,
I mean,
there's
a whole extensive list that
Okay.
I just grabbed like the top ones with the most students in it to get that kind
Please put track back in there.
I mean, the other issues was some of those ones that are small groups. I mean, some of them are 100%, but they're only like 3 students. So statistically, it kind of skewed it a little bit. But the ones that have big student population and big free and reduced lunch ones are the ones that I put in here. But we have a whole list of those
Thank
sports
you.
by school and free and reduced lunch
Okay,
count.
thank you.
And I think, obviously we don't generally bring policy without having a discussion. You guys are in those policy workshops, so this would kind of, in my mind, be the policy discussion. So if you see this on a future agenda, the board has had an opportunity to have input, I think was the thought process. Is that correct, Shane?
Yes, sir. So rather than to repeal, are we talking editing this and removing A? Is that what I'm hearing? That we take out eligibility standard A and move forward with that, or are we talking a whole?
No. I think we would take out the fees for extracurricular activities. It's on 6152. It's a bullet that's on there.
Right.
Just delete that. Uniform or equipment for, they buy their own uniforms? I don't know, y'all tell us, y'all.
So they do fundraise through that, and that is through Fair Share, but the schools work with families who aren't able to do that and provide opportunities or other scholarshiping opportunities. I think in conversation with the principals, especially the high school principals, that this impacted the most, but there is certainly a middle school and I guess could be to some extent an elementary impact. they work with the families, and I should defer to Mr. Andrew, who's been a high school principal. You work with the families so that students are not excluded from participating because they can't afford a fair share or a fee. But I defer to you.
Correct. All schools that I've ever worked with, our colleagues that are in the schools right now, have always made accommodations, and so have the band directors, the fine arts. So I guess it would be from the bottom, the third and fourth, because it's uniform and equipment fees and extracurricular fees, right? I think it would be those two bullets is.
Graduation fees, what about that? Are there graduation fees? I don't know what that.
So it would include like cap and
and
gown
gown?
and things like that, but sometimes the provider for, like, for instance, Herff Jones or what have you, would help the schools with defraying the cost because so many are being purchased by them, and then we would give scholarships to students who were under this need. So it really just depends. Also, previous students who have graduated, who purchased their cap and gown, we encourage them to bring them back if they don't want them, and then we allow for those to be utilized for students who are unable to pay.
So, so I guess you think leaving, if we leave graduation fees in here, are there that many students that we feel that, well, our whole student body populations could say they could be exempt from graduation fees for cap and gowns? Not all, I mean, the free and reduced lunch and that's how I'm reading this.
So there's no fee associated with the ceremony or the money. The board, the district pays a lot to rent the venues and to do all in the security and all of those things. But I believe, I would defer to Dr. Edwards or Mr. Andrew, that the costs on the student side, and as a mother I know, it's the cap and gown, and that is what we make sure every student has that who's graduating. Things like class rings or grad bash, we don't necessarily do all of that, but anything relating to graduation, the ceremony, we're gonna make sure you get across that stage and you're wearing all the right things.
I just want to make a clarification. So when I look at bullet point 4, uniform or equipment fees for sports or fine arts programs, I'm thinking that's school day programs. So like if a student takes an art class as part of their 6-period day, there might be a fee or something they have to purchase for that we should cover if they can't afford it. Does that never happen? Because like what I was seeing, fees for extracurricular activities, wouldn't that cover sports or band or anything that's outside of the school day? I'm thinking this stuff, like the bullet above that would be, and maybe our district doesn't have any fees like that, but I know some districts do.
Are you talking about for music or art supplies? We don't charge for that.
Okay, so we don't charge like if you're doing band, we don't charge a fee for like the reeds or anything for the instruments.
Students may be responsible for buying their own reeds, but that's that situation where we also work with students, and we don't want you to not be in band because you can't afford reeds for your clarinet.
Right, so that's what I would think would go under that bullet, because extracurricular activities, that would be like the marching band and all of that, right?
Well, it's
I don't know.
curricular because it's during the school day and outside of the school day.
I just don't want us to delete a bullet that would protect a kid who can't afford to buy their own reeds or their own sketch pencils or whatever it is that they might need.
So my suggestion would be to engage our secondary principals. I can tell you, after I shared this policy with them, they had a lot of thoughts. So maybe, of course, defer to the superintendent, but maybe it would be good to bring them back in and kind of show the policy revisions that we're talking about. And they are there every day. They know the students, they know the services and the costs associated. That would be my suggestion.
So I like that suggestion, and I recalled I wanted to get the rulemaking rulemaking process started so that this can be done before school starts. That is why I wanted it here. So we got to get them where they can come, or they have a representative. They can talk to each other amongst each other, or whatever.
I can tell you they'd be more than happy to meet. I could call a meeting tonight at 6 o'clock and they'd show up. That's how much interest there is in this.
Yeah. Well, if we have the discussion tonight and it's on a future agenda, Ms. Andrew, did you put this as I requested on the next agenda, or could you mention bringing it today on the workshop?
We brought it to the workshop today.
Right, so it's not on the agenda on June 6th?
No.
Okay. 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 Okay, so then I guess tell whoever the date that it would be so that they can let the principals know. And I guess they could give us feedback, mark it like by email or whatever. They could send it to you guys or somebody.
Or a quick Zoom meeting or
Or
something.
a Zoom or
like that.
something like
Yes,
that
ma'am.
with, yeah. So I don't want it to be delayed is what I'm trying to get done since Mr. Purvis and those brought this up in our last budget committee meeting in April. And so I wanted us to make sure we got it resolved before then. So. Okay.
That's all we have.
That's all you got?
Yeah,
Anyone
that's
have
it.
any questions?
Is that not enough? You guys want?
Do we have any public input on the phone? We have some public input in the audience. Come on, give us your name. You'll have 3 minutes with the board. Your name, that's it. Your name.
I have a lot of sympathy for y'all wrestling with the whole notion of separating or conjoining different schools and trying to get racial and economic balance. It's a crime of the whole society that you're still dealing with that period. That should have been a transitional cost somewhere in the early 60s when the school desegregation was happening. But that movement stopped progressing is the problem. That's why you're still dealing with it. I say that the civil rights movement went to sleep or was shot to sleep after just sort of a feint, a baby step one at a real sea change in society. Desegregating schools was supposed to be just an initial exposure. The two then major groups, ethnic groups in American society coming to tolerate each other's company without violence or fear. So what really was supposed to happen was a desegregation of housing. That's what King's Poor People's Campaign would have been working toward, because economic inequality was enforcing housing segregation, but it was a vicious circle, from the time of FDR forward, introducing housing segregation where it didn't even exist in some places, reinforcing it in others, and every urban area desegregated, and it really goes even much further back than that. 1877, from the redemption forward, when economic status was artificially linked with ethnicity. It's such a complex web that you're having to wrestle with part of that should have been a sea change to society that got cut off. And both communities were making sacrifice. Zora Neale Hurston was right in '55 when she said that, look at that decision, desegregating the schools will cause black children to lose the most dedicated professionals in their lives and the web of home, family, church, community that was giving academic success even in raggedy buildings and raggedy books. But that was supposed to be a transitional sacrifice on the way to a society where we would have mixed, ethnically and economically mixed housing pattern throughout our communities. Families live next to each other and overcome racism. Children get sent to school with each other to experiment with becoming familiar with the two groups. We stopped at the experiment. You're still paying for the artificial balance because the full balance never happened. You need to urge your colleagues on the city and county commissions to take the prerogative they've been talking about, jaw-jacking about, for 3 years, inclusionary zoning, to create mixed income, mixed racial housing across our communities, the evening out of tax base, the evening out of resources, the easing of interracial tensions. And so that's why you have this extreme difficulty and cost Wrestling was something that should have been resolved a long time ago on the whole system, outside of just our education system. So, but please, don't give up the fight. Now, if you're in a place of infinite resources and you can change this and never change that, and I'm talking to Member Abbott, yes, magnet programs have been productive. Yes, it's horrible to think of changing them. But if you take a picture that has some terrible failure in it, you change one margin, all you do is shift the picture over. It's the same picture. You have to be ready for change all around. I've spent a lot of time at Lincoln in the fall this past year. We're trying to launch a contest, a Black History contest. But because of behavior issues, we couldn't get it going. But I saw plenty of brilliant kids in the regular program who could have made it in the magnet. So the access is the issue. It's not that you want to alter that program, you want to open it up, you want all the system to become that good.
Thank you, Mr. Blunt, for your input. Yes, go ahead. Yes, caller, have you brought them in? Caller, you're okay. Oh, we've had internet issues all evening. Okay, well, I thought it was just my iPad needing to be updated just now. Does anyone have any questions or comments for, oh, okay. All right, let's take our caller, go ahead. Caller, go
Hi,
ahead.
good afternoon.
Please state your name.
Sorry.
3 minutes with the board.
Yes, ma'am. Good afternoon. This is Rochelle George. Forgive me if I miss a few things. The coverage has been spotty and cutting in and out, so we've been trying to follow along. Regarding the magnet programs and the potential of moving magnet programs from their existing schools, I think we should add more magnet programs rather than worrying about moving magnet programs that have been successful at existing schools, especially when infrastructure has already been put in place for those magnet programs. It would not be feasible, logistical, or financial to move those magnet programs. For example, the financial and entrepreneurship at Buchholz. I think it's been clearly stated by parents, community partners, and everything that that program should stay in place. When it comes to the students in the magnet programs, we have students that are below grade level. They have IEPs. There's numerous special programs, special learning, teacher assistants for our students below grade level, which is wonderful. Everybody wants to get those students on grade level, but we also shouldn't leave out the students that are above grade level and just forget about them. The magnet programs do, in many cases, help students who are academically above grade level, and if we want our students to have the best success that they can in Alachua County Public Schools, we should give the same tools to every student, whether they are below grade level, on grade level, or above grade level. When it comes to retainage of teachers, bus drivers, and everything, if you would listen to your one school board member and laser focus in on the discipline issues, it would alleviate teacher shortages. It would help with bus driver shortages. It's time to focus on the things that we can change, and there are items in the district that have been voted on, decided on. It's time to move on from those and quit trying to stir that bottom of the pot and distract from current issues before you, which is rezoning and magnet programs. So again, stay focused on schools. Moving magnet programs from certain schools would make absolutely no sense, and there would be no valid reason. Let's give all these kids the same things. If anything, I agree with some of the board members. Let's add some more magnet programs for all the kids at every school so every kid could have a magnet program that would interest them at each and every school.
Thank you. I did have one other, I just looked at my notes. Ms. Wise, have we heard anything back from Santa Fe about the articulation agreement? The letter, has that been sent? Have we followed up?
I got final approval on that letter this week, and we'll be sending it.
So board, just so, I think there was in the packet, one of the, it wasn't, I didn't think it was, in one of the budget packets where the articulation agreement between us and Santa Fe, we're trying to negotiate that down because right now we're paying more than our local schools, so. All right, if there's, you have, yes.
I don't know if this is for Superintendent Andrew or Ms. Wise, but I know that summer school's going to be starting, and I know we had talked about how we were going to assess students, and I'm wondering if we know that, what we're going to use.
Right, so there'll be a pre-test and a post-test for ELA and in our SI schools in math and science for the PM session, and in our secondary schools, there'll be a math and science pre and post-test. So we'll be able to bring that back to you.
Okay, thank you. And then the other thing is that there is a subgroup, obviously, in every school that's not an SI school that's struggling. And I'm wondering if I was told that they can't attend the full-day summer school at the SI schools. Is that wrong or right?
I'm sorry, will you say the question again? Are you saying a student from a non-SI school could come to the afternoon at an SI school?
That's in a subgroup that needs help.
I would think if there were spaces, we could figure out how to do that. I'm not sure the SI schools have spaces that aren't reserved for their own students, because it is a relatively smaller part of our ESY in the afternoon.
I'm just hoping that if the SI spaces aren't full, that we'll reach out to those other schools.
Yes, ma'am. We want every spot to be full.
So that those subgroups can
Agreed.
get in there.
Yes, ma'am.
Madam Chair, I think that there's one other question I had. Summer school starts Monday, correct? Okay, when are teachers going to get their curriculums in their materials so they'll know how to prepare for Monday?
Well, it should be almost all ready for them now. I think we're still waiting on some of the science materials. The ELA and the math materials are ready. It's kind of a manpower issue with science. We have one specialist for K through 12, but it's very close to being ready as well.
For elementary school, are we doing any math? Or it's just
In the afternoon at the SI schools, yes, ma'am.
Okay. Thank you.
Ms. Wise, what's the pre and post test for the non-testing grades? Like is it K through 5?
District developed, yes, ma'am, that'll cover the standards that are taught this summer.
Anything else for our staff before we adjourn? All right, thank you, we're adjourned.